In the year of our Lord 1348, the bells rang no more. They had tolled each morning since before memory began. Soft bronze voices floating through stone alleys, over the abbey gardens, and across fields dappled with clover and grazing sheep. Their chimes marked birth and burial, fast and feast, and their music bound the lives of peasants and lords alike. But on one windless morning in early summer, their songs ceased. In the village of Thistlebrook, hidden among the rolling downs of England's southern reaches, the silence was not only heard, but felt. The people knew something ancient had ended. Thistlebrook had always been a quiet village, tucked neatly along the riverway. Its people were humble folk, ploughmen, thatchers, and weavers, who knew their saints better than their kings. On Sundays, they knelt on cold stone before the Virgin, lips pressed to the edge of her altar, hearts trembling with awe. But lately, even the Virgin seemed to look away. It began, as most endings do, with a whisper, a murmur from the west, a tale carried by a merchant's cart or a wandering friar. Towns in Gascony shuttered, priests burned alive in Florence, ships adrift in the Channel with no soul aboard to moor them. There were stories of stars falling from the sky, of nightbirds screaming in the daylight, and of the dead who bled black and boiled from within. In truth, no one believed them, not at first. People said such things every generation, and each time the earth rolled on. But this was no tale spun by fearful nuns or drunkards in the alehouse. This was the plague. When it reached Thistlebrook, it did not knock. It tore the doors from their hinges. Old Emot was the first to fall. She had lived through 3 kings and outlived 6 husbands. Some said she had the gift of foresight. She spoke in riddles and slept with herbs beneath her pillow. One morning, the children who came to beg sweetwort from her garden found her cold, her eyes wide open, blackened at the corners, staring at nothing. A boil had burst on her neck. Her lips were blue. The children screamed. By Vespers, 3 others had joined her in death. It spread fast, too fast. The baker's boy collapsed beside his ovens, scalded dough still stuck to his hands. The Reeves' youngest daughter wept blood before nightfall. Dogs howled at shutters closed too late, and cats slunk into the woods and did not return. Smoke rose from chimneys, thick and oily, families burning the linens of the dead. But still, it crept. People fled, but found no escape. Brother Theobald, the village priest, remained. He was not a brave man by nature, nor particularly beloved. His sermons were dull, his hymns warbled. But when others ran to the hills or locked themselves in root cellars, he stayed. He held the hands of the dying, even when they trembled and blistered. He muttered prayers with lips so chapped they bled. And each morning he rang the church bell, until the morning he didn't. That was when the villagers knew. It was one thing to suffer, but to suffer without God's voice in the morning air, that was unbearable. Ellen Tanner, just 16 and recently betrothed, stood alone in her cottage that day. Her parents had passed the week before. Her betrothed had ridden to Winchester and never returned. She tied a strip of linen across her mouth and nose, just as the herbal woman had once taught her, and stepped into the street. She passed silent doors, shuttered tight. Chickens wandered, half feral. A child sat in the mud, covered in sores, unmoving. Ellen walked on. To the church. She expected to find Father Theobald dead upon the altar. Instead, she found him kneeling. Not in prayer, but in tears. "My voice is gone," he rasped, seeing her. "I tried to call him. The bell. It would not sing." Ellen stepped to the rope and gave it a tug. Nothing. The bell did not stir. No echo, no chime. As if the air itself had grown too thick for sound to pass. Some would later say it was a miracle. Others, a curse. But in that moment, standing beside a weeping priest in a chapel filled with the smell of burning incense and old sickness, Ellen knew only this. They had been abandoned. The days grew longer. A pale sun hung low and unmoving in the sky, casting everything in a grey, brittle light. The river slowed, and the wind rarely stirred. The mill stopped turning. Mice overran the granary. What food remained grew mould. Mothers no longer sang lullabies. The midwife sharpened her shears and wept alone in the stable, knowing she would never deliver another child. Still, some survived. By what measure, God's mercy or sheer unexplainable luck, none could say. Ellen did not succumb. Nor did old Tom, the blacksmith whose hands were too large to write, but who carved saints into wood with trembling reverence. Nor did little Aldous, who had never spoken a word in his 5 short years, but who now walked barefoot through the streets, feeding bread crusts to rats. Survivors, they were called, but in truth, they did not feel like they had survived anything. What they had done was endure. They sat, most days, in silence. Sometimes they would meet in the nave of the church, which now held more ghosts than pews. They did not speak of the plague or the bodies buried in the field beyond the oak grove. They did not ask why. The bell tower stood still above them, empty, a monument to the world that had once sung. In the stillness, they listened, to the creak of timbers long unshored, to the flutter of crows nesting in the rafters, to their own breath, shallow and slow, waiting for whatever came next. They did not know that elsewhere other bells had also fallen silent, in Bruges, in Lyon, in York. Nor did they know that their quiet suffering would one day be studied, measured, dissected by scholars in fine robes with clean hands, that poems would be written, that some would even say the plague had led to progress. Ellen did not care for progress. She cared only for the moment each morning when her eyes opened, and breath filled her lungs, and she remembered, again, that she was alone. After the bells ceased, it was hunger that came next. Not the ordinary sort, the kind a peasant knew well from Lent or poor harvests, but a gnawing, aching emptiness that lived beneath the ribs and behind the eyes. It was a hunger that crept into one's bones and sat like lead in the belly, making sleep shallow and dreams dark. The fields, once emerald seas of barley and rye, lay empty now. No hands scythed the wheat. No oxen ploughed the soil. The peasants who once bent their backs to the land had bent them to the grave instead. The land, abandoned, had begun to forget its keepers. Weeds grew where onions had once nestled. Crows gathered where scarecrows fell, their straw guts spilling into tilled rows like the intestines of soldiers after battle. Ellen Tanner, who had not spoken aloud in 3 days, stepped barefoot into the orchard behind the tithing barn. The apples were unripe, hard, bitter things still cloaked in green, but she took one anyway. Her fingers trembled as she lifted it to her lips. She did not bite. She only breathed in its sharp scent, willing her stomach to believe. Behind her, the world was still. It had been 15 days since the last body burned. Some might have called that a triumph, others, an omen. Ellen had stopped keeping count. She no longer prayed either, not because she had lost faith, but because she had used every word she knew. She felt that if she said another Our Father, the syllables might crack and crumble in her throat like dry bread. What prayers could be left after the earth had swallowed so many? In the square, a handful of souls emerged like ghosts from doorways sealed too long. Tom the blacksmith limped along the edge of the well, his face thinner now, like it had been carved of weathered bark. Little Aldous walked beside him, clutching a stale roll of bread. The boy did not eat it. He only carried it, as if the weight of food was reassurance enough. They met by silent agreement each morning now, those who had survived. They did not gather to speak, nor to plan, only to be seen, to remember that they were not yet names on the parish roll. The hunger changed people, not always in cruel ways, but in quiet ones. Ellen noticed it first in the way people looked at animals, not with affection, but calculation. The few pigs that had not escaped the pens were eyed like treasure. A single goose was kept beneath a wash basin, and it was said that the widow Langley whispered to it at night, as if it were her late husband come back in feathered form. No one touched it. Not yet. There was something sacred in that act of restraint. But every day, the hunger grew. They scavenged at first. Roots from the abandoned herb garden, crumbs swept from the altar steps, flour so old it clumped like chalk. Tom melted beeswax once, mixing it with nettle to form a sort of cake. Ellen ate it. She cried afterward, not from disgust, but from shame. To be reduced to wax and weeds was to be less than a beast. She still dreamed of roasted lamb, of honeyed bread, of cheese so ripe it could perfume a room. But dreams were crueler now. They woke her hungrier than before. It was Aldous who found the goat. It had belonged to the Reeves family once. Now it stood alone in the north pasture, bleating beside a broken gate. The boy brought it home with a length of frayed rope. His arms bore scratches from the brambles. He said nothing, only pointed to the goat and waited for approval. None came. Instead, silence stretched. Ellen, Tom, the widow Langley, and 3 others stared at the creature as if it were an angel fallen from heaven. It nibbled at a patch of moss with perfect innocence. A goat knew nothing of plague or famine. It only lived. "What shall we do?" Tom asked finally. No one answered. They all knew what should be done. The goat could feed them, its milk at least, its meat eventually, but to kill it, so soon, so completely, was to admit the worst had yet to pass. "Let it be," Ellen whispered. "If we're to kill it, we should not do it hungry." No one argued. They named the goat Mercy. In the following days, they shared its milk by turns. Not enough to sate the gnawing within, but enough to take the edge off. They thinned it with water, with river reeds, with hope. The hunger softened, but did not vanish. Children, those few who remained, were the first to smile again. They played not with dolls or carved knights, but with bone. They tied horsehair into nets and tried to catch sparrows. Their laughter was strange. Sharper now, as if tinged with hysteria, but it was laughter all the same. Adults took longer. It was Ellen who dared first to sing. A lullaby. The kind her mother used to hum while kneading dough. Her voice was hoarse, the notes off key, but the melody hung in the air like smoke. Others listened. Tom wept. Aldous crawled into her lap and did not move until nightfall. Something fragile stirred in that moment, something that had not stirred in many weeks. Not joy, not peace, but endurance. The hunger still ruled them, but they had remembered something more powerful. The comfort of human sound, the rhythm of familiarity. Even as the world remained broken, there was song. Each evening, they sat in a circle outside the church. No fire, no feast, only themselves and what little food remained. The goat's milk, a few parsnips, dandelion leaves. They passed them as if sharing communion, and no one took more than their due. Even the rats, once feared, were now companions. They scurried underfoot with impunity, no longer chased. Aldous left crumbs for them. Ellen named one Gregory. It sat on her shoulder while she sang. Tom joked, once, that perhaps the rats had been the Lord's all along. No one laughed. But they remembered his words, and the hunger, though ever present, began to teach them something strange, what they could do without. Not only food, but pride, vanity, anger. They needed one another now, needed patience, kindness, songs, stories. Even the silence became less hostile, more a companion than an enemy, and thus, in the deep marrow of the famine, something impossible took root, the first seed of community reborn. They had survived the plague. Now, they would survive the hunger. By the 3rd month after the bells had gone silent, the dead began to return, not in flesh, but in memory. They peered from windows long unshuttered, leaned against walls no longer warm, and lingered in corners where once their laughter had lived. Every house in Thistlebrook had ghosts now, and those who survived walked among them carefully, as if stepping on sacred ground. It was not the plague itself that haunted most. No, it was what came after. To survive the Black Death was not to escape it. The sickness passed, yes, the pustules drained, the fevers broke, but its shadow remained. It clung to the hems of gowns and the rust on abandoned tools. It pressed into the grain of the wooden door where one had watched a sister fade. It whispered in the flicker of candlelight, reminding, always, of those who were gone. Ellen Tanner felt it most in the mornings. The quiet, once welcome, now stretched too long. She awoke each day with the sun slanting through the slats of the shutter. Her fingers curled around the hem of her blanket as if holding on to the last dream of the night. Often she dreamed of her mother. Sometimes of her sister Anne, who had been buried behind the herb garden without priest or psalm. In those dreams, they stood just beyond reach, beckoning. When she reached out, they vanished. It was inescapable, this new stillness. The village felt hollow. Shops stood open, with goods untouched. The cobbler's bench still held the last shoe he ever made. The cooper's casks, half filled, had turned sour. One could walk the length of the lane and hear nothing but the scuff of one's own feet and the occasional creak of wind-stirred eaves. The survivors began to speak in softer voices, not out of reverence, but from instinct, as if too loud a word might awaken something best left sleeping. Some claimed to see the dead. Widow Langley swore she heard her husband whispering from the well. Tom confessed that at night he caught glimpses of his apprentice John, watching from the forge with soot-stained eyes. Even Aldous, the silent boy, once pointed to the empty belfry and tugged Ellen's sleeve, mouthing, "They're still there." Ellen, herself, heard no voices, but the air in her own home had changed. It felt watched, not menacing, but familiar, heavy with memory. The ghost of her sister was not cruel, but she was persistent. Anne had been the louder of the two. She laughed easily, sang even more. She had danced with bare feet in the rain and stolen gooseberries from the priest's fence. And now, Ellen heard the echoes of that laughter when the wind caught the stones just right. She began leaving bits of bread on the sill, the way her mother once did for passing beggars. It was foolish, but somehow comforting. The ghosts were not alone. With the passage of time, wanderers began to arrive. First came a girl no older than Ellen, carrying a sack of herbs and a wooden cross carved in crude detail. She said nothing, simply nodded when offered a bowl of goat's milk and slept beneath the church porch with her arms wrapped tight around her satchel. Next came a man with one arm and eyes like pale glass. He had no name, or none he offered, but played a small, wooden flute by the riverside in the evenings. His melodies were slow, sorrowful things that made the air shiver. Others followed, orphans, mourners, survivors from hamlets that had fared worse than Thistlebrook. One man arrived weeping for a wife he had left behind in a ditch outside Salisbury. Another woman came pregnant, with no knowledge of how far along, and eyes that had already said farewell to hope. They brought stories, tales of entire towns burned to the ground, of nobles who sealed themselves inside stone halls only to die of rot, of priests who turned bandit, and bandits who took vows and walked barefoot into the sea, and Ellen listened. Every evening the survivors, both native and new, gathered in the square. Not to mourn, for they had exhausted mourning, but to remember. They spoke their dead's names aloud, passing them from mouth to mouth like relics. They told stories of harvests past, of midsummer feasts, of marriages that had once filled the green with colour and song. The ghosts no longer haunted. They attended. Some began writing names on scraps of wood, placing them in the crooks of trees or beneath the Virgin's feet in the chapel. Others braided ribbons and tied them to door handles. One for each soul lost in the house. The wind carried them gently, like whispered prayers. A sort of peace settled over Thistlebrook, not the peace of contentment, but of endurance, of memory, honoured, and with that peace came the beginning of purpose. They started to clean. Ellen took to the church, scrubbing away layers of ash and grime until the altar shone faintly again. Tom repaired hinges and cleared debris from the well. Even Aldous, still silent, found purpose in gathering stones from the overgrown paths and lining them in neat rows. There was dignity in motion. A woman named Cecily, newly arrived from over the hills, began gathering herbs. She brewed tisanes from nettles and rose hips, adding dried berries when she could find them. She spoke little, but sang while she worked. The tune had no words, but it stilled even the most restless spirits. Soon, others followed her lead. Work, they learned, could quiet the ghosts. It was not about rebuilding, not yet. It was about presence, about claiming each hour, each corner of the village, not for death, but for the living. The church bell still did not ring, but Ellen no longer needed it to. In the silence, there were new sounds, the scrubbing of brush against stone, the creak of cartwheels long unused, the rustle of breath in prayer. Not prayers for salvation, but prayers of thanks, for survival, for memory, for mourning. And in the stillness of night, Ellen no longer feared the voices. She welcomed them. They reminded her that love had once lived here, and that somehow it lived still. The plague had left the throne empty. Not the throne of kings, for Edward still reigned from Westminster, but the small thrones in every village, every farmstead, the chairs at hearths now cold, the stools beside looms untouched, the head seats at tables too wide for what few sat around them now. Authority had not vanished, it had simply gone quiet. And in Thistlebrook, that silence pressed heavily upon the people. Once they had a reeve, a man elected by custom and murmured assent to keep order, settle disputes, ensure grain tithes reached the manor. But he had perished. In the second week, his body burnt without ceremony when the sores upon his throat darkened and cracked. His family followed 2 days later. Since then, no one had claimed his post. No one dared. Leadership in the wake of death was a burden no soul willingly sought, and yet, life demanded order. It began small. The well needed guarding, the goats tended. Disputes arose over simple things. A patch of turnips left growing wild behind the Fletcher's barn. A window shutter removed to patch a leaking roof. A pie, mistakenly or not, taken from a windowsill. Tom, the blacksmith, stepped in when needed. Not with declarations, but with presence. His hands were calloused, his voice gravelly, but people listened. He spoke little, but when he did, it held the weight of smoke and iron and old grief. But even he grew weary. It was Ellen who noticed. He lingered too long in the forge some nights, staring into embers without hammer or tongs in hand. Once, she found him seated in the ruined garden behind the old manor, speaking to no one. When she approached, he offered no excuse, only a soft nod, as if he had expected her. "It's too much," he said simply. "Too many needs, too few hands." She did not offer comfort. Instead, she sat beside him, knees drawn to her chest, and listened as the wind stirred through the barley stubble and broken fences. That night, she dreamed again, not of her sister this time, but of her father, a man with strong arms and kinder words than most. In the dream, he stood beside a tree with leaves like vellum, and in his hands he held a crown made not of gold, but of woven straw and feathers. When she woke, she did not cry. She dressed in silence, washed her face with cold water from a basin lined with ice crystals, and stepped into the grey light of dawn. By the chapel, a crowd had gathered, not in fear, but confusion. Someone had taken the old parish board. the one where tithes were once listed, and pinned a strip of parchment to it with an iron nail. On it were 3 words, "Let us gather." No name, no seal, no sign of who had written it. But when the sun stood high, the villagers came. They brought little, only themselves, wrapped in cloaks patched with memory, faces thin and wind-burnt, hands empty but open. Children clung to sleeves. Elders leaned on staffs. Even the wanderers, uncertain in their place among the born and bred of Thistlebrook, stood on the edge of the green. Ellen was among them, though she had not been the one to nail the message. She thought briefly that perhaps the ghosts had done it, or perhaps it did not matter. Tom stepped forward first. He stood beneath the shade of the old lime tree, beside the abandoned stocks and the moss-covered bench where once the reeve held court. His voice, when it came, was steady. "I don't wish to lead," he said, "but we must decide who shall." A murmur passed through the crowd, not resistance, but hesitation. No one wanted the burden. No one wanted to be the one others turned to when meat grew scarce, or fences fell, or hands grew ill again. But nor could they afford chaos. It was Cecily, the herbal woman, who first offered a path. "Let it be shared," she said. "Not a lord, not a reeve, a council, 3 to speak for us all, chosen by lot." There were nods, there were murmurs of approval, and so, with a clay cup and scraps of parchment, the names were drawn. Ellen's fingers shook when she pulled the yeo. First, it bore Tom's name. The second, drawn by Aldous, who giggled softly as if it were a game, read Cecily. The third was blank at first, but as it caught the light, faint script appeared. Ellen. She stared, lips parted, not in protest, but quiet astonishment. Someone had written her name. Later she would wonder who. She would never learn, but it did not matter. By sundown, Thistlebrook had its first council. There were no robes, no scrolls, no fealty given, only 3 souls standing before the people, hands clasped and eyes uncertain. But in that moment, something shifted. It was not power, nor control. It was trust. The price of the empty throne, they realized, was not just absence, it was responsibility, shared. A community reborn, not from command, but from consent. Their first decisions were humble. Guard the well in shifts. Post watch at the edge of the village, in case less kind travellers arrived. Share food, not hoard it. Return tools to their owners, or if none remained, to the chapel to be borrowed in turn. A ledger was kept, by Ellen, who had the clearest script. She wrote with charcoal on sheep gut, her letters small and careful, not because they feared theft, but because memory mattered. In a world rebuilt from the ashes, every act, no matter how small, became sacred. That night, under a moon dulled by cloud, the council met in the old rectory. They lit no fire. They spoke quietly, and they planned, not for a season, or a harvest, or a tax, but for tomorrow, and the tomorrow after that, because surviving the plague had not meant safety, it had only meant beginning again, and that was its own kind, of weight. By the time the harvest moon rose, swollen and pale above the withered hills, Thistlebrook was a village stitched together by ash and silence. The moonlight spread across roofs mended with spare thatch, over fields more brown than green, and touched the tops of gravestones that had never been carved. No one had tools to chisel names anymore, and even if they had, few remembered the exact spelling of those lost. Instead, the survivors left tokens, braided straw, dried sprigs of rosemary, or scraps of fabric from garments too precious to discard. The dead had no voice, but they were not forgotten. Ellen stood one evening just beyond the boundary where the soil dipped and turned brittle, the place where the plague pits lay. It had once been a pasture, full of buzzing flies and wandering sheep. Now it was a Hayasi meadow of sorrow. There were no markers, only the uneven swell of earth and the absence of birdsong. Beside her, Tom rested on a crude walking stick fashioned from an old rake handle. He said nothing. He rarely did now, unless words were necessary. She appreciated that. "This land will never grow wheat again," Ellen said quietly. He nodded, staring at the ground as if it might speak back. They had come not for mourning, but for remembering. It had been 6 months since the sickness first reached Thistlebrook. 6 months since the bells fell silent. 6 months since the world turned inward, and those who lived became shadows of the ones they had been. The council had held Ellen, Tom, and Cecily. It wasn't easy. Each decision, no matter how small, brought with it burden. Whether to distribute the remaining honey, or how many hours to watch the forest path, or who should walk the cold stream to gather water when the well froze over, all became matters of debate and consequence. But more than food or shelter, what the village struggled with most was meaning. For to survive is not always to live, and living in the shell of a world was like wandering through a cathedral long abandoned by its god. Autumn crept in on soft feet. It was less golden than in years past, more grey, more brittle, but it still came. Leaves curled into themselves, and the wind carried with it the faint scent of old apples and wood smoke. The nights grew colder, and with them came dreams. Deeper, darker dreams. People stopped speaking of what they'd seen in their sleep. It was understood. Ellen's own dreams took her beneath the earth. She would walk through tunnels carved of bone and breath, guided only by the sound of her sister's voice echoing through the corridors. She'd follow, always just too far behind, until the path narrowed and she awoke gasping, her bedsheet clutched tight in her fists like the reins of a wild horse. Others slept beside hearths now, in pairs or trios, not from need of warmth alone, but for the comfort of hearing another's breath nearby. The silence of solitary rooms had become too deep. By mid-October, the question no one wanted to ask finally came. What of next spring? It was Cecily who raised it, her voice low as she stirred a kettle of nettle broth. "If we mean to sow," she said, "we must start soon." There was a pause. Not of resistance, but grief. To plant again was to hope again. And hope, after such loss, was a blade with 2 edges. They met that evening under the harvest moon. The whole village. Even the recluses, even the mute, even the wanderers who had never meant to stay, but could not bring themselves to leave. They sat on logs and upturned buckets, on cloaks spread across damp grass, and watched the moon rise, and Ellen, seated at the centre, spoke what none dared. "Let this be the year we begin." No one cheered. There was no jubilation, no raised hands or dancing, just a long silence, then a single nod, then another, then the passing of a single seed, an apple pit from one hand to the next, a gesture, a vow. The following days were filled with labour, not the sort driven by energy or enthusiasm, but the slow, steady kind that knows the shape of grief and chooses to move despite it. They cleared brambles, dug shallow furrows, gathered seeds from the chapel storeroom, from forgotten pantries, from the hems of cloaks and the cracks in the stone walls where wind had tucked them away. Ellen planted rosemary at the edge of every new bed. A sign, she said, for remembrance. Some whispered that the earth would reject them, that too much sorrow had soaked into the soil, that seeds planted in such places could only grow bitter. But the first sprouts broke through a week later, small, pale, fragile. Still, they grew. Children were the first to notice. Aldous ran through the tilled beds with a smile broader than the moon's own, pointing at shoots like treasure. Others joined him. Some helped, some simply watched, but all understood. This was the turning. The living had chosen not just to survive, but to sow. Yet not all were ready. The chapel remained a place of solitude, more mausoleum than sanctuary. The Virgin, still, draped in soot-stained cloth, looked down from her niche with eyes that had seen too much. Some prayed. Others couldn't bear to kneel. Ellen found herself drawn there one night, unable to sleep. She lit a single beeswax candle, not for prayer, but for memory. And as the flame flickered, she whispered the names of the lost, not aloud, just enough for the walls to hear. Then she sat, and she wept, not from despair, but from the weight of having endured. The next morning, someone had swept the chapel floor. The cloth on the Virgin had been washed, and beside her feet sat a bowl of early berries, unripe, sour but full of colour. The message was clear. We remember. We begin again. And beneath the pale gaze of the harvest moon, Thistlebrook took its first step into a new season, not of mourning, but of meaning. The first snow fell in silence. No one in Thistlebrook cheered its arrival, though in years before the plague, the first flurry would have sent children rushing out to taste the flakes on their tongues. There would have been singing, stories by the hearth, warm cider poured thick into pewter cups. But this winter was different. This winter came to a people who were not ready to dream, only to endure. Ellen awoke to find her window rimmed with frost like spun glass, the panes so cold. Her breath froze on contact. Outside, the world lay blanketed in white, hushed and unmoving. Snow softened the ruins, covered the graves, and turned broken fences into gentle sculptures. It was beautiful in the way that sorrow often is. Still, cold, and absolute. She wrapped herself in a cloak 2 sizes too large, once worn by her father, and stepped into the quiet. No birds, no bells, only the creak of snow beneath her feet and the soft sway of smoke from half-lit chimneys. Winter was not unexpected, but it was feared. The food they had stored was meagre. Root vegetables, dried beans, wild herbs bundled in string, and the last of the goat's milk curdled into a hard, crumbly cheese. The fields were bare, the woods sparse. Hunting parties returned empty-handed more often than not, their arrows dulled from reuse, their hands raw with cold. Yet they tried. Each morning, Tom and 2 boys from the outer edge of the village made their way into the forest. They set traps, followed hoofprints, climbed trees in search of nests. Once, they returned with a single squirrel and 6 frozen mushrooms. It fed 8 people. It tasted of nothing, Ellen wrote in her ledger that night. But we laughed, and so it was enough. The hunger returned, not as fierce as before, but constant. A slow erosion of strength. Knees buckled more quickly. Tasks took longer. Tempers, while mostly gentle, sometimes flared. It was the absence of the saints that troubled Ellen most. In winters past, the village had celebrated them all. St. Nicholas, St. Lucy, St. Thomas, St. Stephen. There had been fasts, processions, small gifts left in shoes, candles lit for miracles and mercy. This year, the saints were silent. No feast days, no bread shaped like doves or lambs, no hymns sung in the snow-chilled chapel. Even the candles were few, tallow grown scarce, and bees long dead. One morning, Aldous asked her, his voice soft with hesitation, "Will St. Lucy still bring light?" Ellen did not know how to answer, so she lied. "She already has," she said, tapping the boy's chest. "She keeps it in there now." That night, she carved a small figure from firewood and placed it in the chapel. St. Lucy with her crown, of candles and downturned eyes. Beside her, she left a shallow bowl of oil and a scrap of wick. The flame burned blue for just a moment, then vanished. The next morning, someone had added a pine sprig. By the end of the week, the saints had returned, not in song or sacrament, but in symbols. Someone drew St. Stephen's wheel on the chapel wall in charcoal. Another left honeyed oats for St. Bridget. A ribbon appeared on the Virgin's hand, blue for hope. No one claimed these acts, but they mattered. They reminded the people that even in a season of frost and absence, they could still choose reverence. They could still honor what had come before, even if they could no longer summon the joy that once accompanied it. Ellen began gathering stories. In the evenings, when frost glittered along the rafters and the hearth spit and hissed with damp wood, she called the children near. She did not tell them the tales of old, of dragons or saints or kings. She told them of the people they had lost. She described how Widow Langley's husband once sang every morning while splitting logs, how the Fletcher, a quiet man with crooked teeth, could whistle bird calls so perfectly that even finches would come, how her own sister Anne had once danced on a table during the harvest feast, barefoot and laughing, her skirt stained with wine. Each memory was a stone placed upon a cairn, each name a seed in frozen ground. The children listened, wide-eyed and silent. Sometimes they asked questions. Was she afraid? Did he cry before he went? Ellen answered when she could, and when she could not, she said simply, they were loved, and that was enough. Midwinter came without a solstice fire. No one dared waste wood. The nights were long and sleep grew thinner. Some claimed to hear whispers on the wind, not ghosts, but voices, regret, longing, hope. They sounded very much the same in winter. One night, Ellen dreamt of the Virgin stepping down from her chapel niche, barefoot in the snow and walking through the village. Everywhere she passed, windows glowed golden. Bread rose in ovens. Flowers grew from cracks in stone. When she awoke, her cheeks were wet with tears. She told no one, but she made extra space beside the fire that morning, in case the dream returned. As January neared, the wind shifted. A warm current, subtle but distinct, crept in from the south. Icicles began to melt. Water dripped from eaves in the afternoons. A crow returned to the chapel roof and cawed once, sharp and loud. It was not spring, but it was a promise. On the final day of the month, Tom brought news. The river's moving again, he said. Just a trickle, but it's begun. Ellen stood in the chapel that evening, holding her ledger, and added one more note to its final page. The world still turns. No trumpets, no miracles, no celestial signs. Just that simple truth. And in the hush of winter, that was miracle enough. The road that led into Thistlebrook had once been just a ribbon of packed earth winding through hedgerows and wooded bends, a path for carts, pilgrims, and sheep alike. Before the plague, it had brought merchants bearing salt and wool, monks with relics in velvet boxes, and players who juggled and sang and made the children laugh for days. Then came the plague, and the road had died with the world. No carts, no laughter, no one coming, and no one going. But in the thaw that followed the long winter, the road stirred. It began with footprints. Ellen found them one morning after frost gave way to soft earth, boot marks in the mud near the chapel gate. She crouched low, pressing her fingers into the indentations, deep, wide set. A man, likely, and carrying weight. No wheel ruts, no animal tracks, just the solitary echo of motion, where no motion had been for months. She stood quickly and scanned the trees. Nothing. But the wind had changed. The others noticed too. Within days, Tom spotted smoke from a distant fire, curling faintly over the northern ridge. Cecily heard a voice calling in the woods, just once, and never again. Aldous found a coin by the stream bank, rubbed smooth by use, marked with a seal unfamiliar to any of them. The road was waking, and with it, uncertainty. "We've been safe," Tom said one evening, his hands warmed by the fire as the village gathered. "Because we've been alone." "But alone is not living," Ellen replied. "Not forever." No one argued, yet all felt the ripple. They had rebuilt something fragile in Thistlebrook, a rhythm, a trust, a quiet continuity. The idea that strangers might return stirred not excitement, but anxiety. Not all wanderers brought kindness. Not all who survived the plague had done so with their honor intact. Stories filtered in like smoke through the rafters, brought by those few who had dared to travel during winter's tale. Tales of lawless bands roving the roads, of priests turned scavengers, of manors abandoned and claimed by those with knives and cold hearts. The world beyond the hedges was no longer the world they remembered, but it was coming back. Ellen was the first to greet the road, not because she was brave, but because she needed to see. She left before dawn with a pouch of dried nettle cake, a length of twine, and her ledger, tucked safely beneath her cloak. "I'll walk to the old milepost," she told Tom, "and return by sundown." Tom did not try to stop her. He only handed her a walking stick and muttered, "Mind the brambles." The milepost stood crooked and moss-covered, half swallowed by ivy. It marked the distance to Winchester in Latin script nearly worn smooth. Beyond it, the road dipped into woodland that had not been cleared in a year or more. Ellen stood at its edge for a long time. Birds flitted overhead, sparrows perhaps, or blackcaps. The wind smelled of thawed earth and crushed violets. Somewhere in the distance, a stream murmured, unseen. And then, footsteps. She froze. Not hers, not imagined. Real. They came slowly, cautiously. From the bend ahead emerged a figure cloaked in patched wool, tall and thin, with a staff of ashwood and a hood pulled low. His boots were crusted with mud, his beard streaked with white. When he saw her, he paused. Neither spoke. Then the man raised one hand, not in warning but in greeting. "Ellen of Thistlebrook?" he asked, his voice rough with disuse. She blinked. "Yes." He lowered his hood. "I bring a letter." Her heart stuttered. "A letter?" He reached into a leather pouch and withdrew a scrap of parchment, bound with red thread. "I am from Firlcombe," he said. "South, 2 days' walk. We heard the plague had passed. We seek word of those who remain." Ellen took the letter. Her hands trembled. The wax seal bore no crest, only the imprint of a thumb and a single word scrawled across the fold. "Kin." She opened it slowly. The ink was faded, but legible. It read, "To the living of Thistlebrook. We remember you. We are few, but we endure. We seek to share knowledge, seed and news. If you read this, send reply. Let the world knit itself back together." Beneath the message was a list of names. 6, none familiar. But it was not the names that mattered. It was the intent. The road had opened. The stranger bowed once, then added quietly, "There are others, villages, survivors. The world is speaking again." Slowly, Ellen nodded. She gave him a bundle of dried herbs, a ribbon to tie at his next resting place, and a message of her own written carefully in her ledger's last page before she tore it free. "To Firlcombe we live. We mourn. We sow again. We welcome peace." She signed simply, "Ellen," and beneath it drew a sprig of rosemary. The man took it with reverence. He left before noon, and Ellen returned home, heart fuller than it had been in many moons. She called a gathering that night. Read the letter aloud. Passed it from hand to hand. Some wept, some stared, some asked what it meant, and Ellen answered with quiet certainty, "It means we are not the last. It meant the world was not gone. It meant they were part of something again." The road, once feared, had become a thread, and Thistlebrook, once severed, now held the knot at its centre. Spring came as a whisper. Green crept slowly up the hedgerows and across the furrowed fields, not in grand flourishes, but in quiet persistence. Buds formed on the hawthorn trees. The air, once sharp with frost, now carried the scent of wet earth and rotting leaves. And though the world had not yet declared its rebirth, it had begun the slow, painful turn toward life. In Thistlebrook, this meant work. The fields had to be turned again. Seeds, carefully rationed through winter, were counted and soaked. The goats thin but breathing, gave milk once more. Children gathered dandelions. Women bent to the earth, fingers numb from effort. Even the chapel garden, long forgotten, was tilled, its soil grey but soft. Ellen found herself moving with a kind of determined slowness. Her days were no longer governed by fear, but by necessity. She rose with the sun, took count of supplies, updated the village ledger, checked in on the elderly, the injured, the quiet. Then she walked the path toward the milepost every few days, not for letters, but for signs, always signs. By mid-April, smoke began to appear on the horizon, not thin cooking smoke, but the kind that spoke of bonfires. Not all fires are friendly. The first sign of trouble came from the southern woods, where Aldous spotted a line of men moving through the trees, 4, maybe 5, cloaked and silent, their boots muddy, their faces hidden. He had followed at a distance, unseen. When he returned, breathless and pale, Ellen asked only one question. Were they armed? He nodded. Blades at their sides. One had a bow, another dragged a cart behind him. No banner, no heraldry, no greeting. That night, the village gathered. Not around a feast, but around fear. We should hide the stores, Cecily whispered. And the tools, Tom added. Anything they might steal. But Ellen said nothing for a long time. Instead, she looked toward the chapel, where the flame before the Virgin burned low. Then, softly, we do not know their intent. Tom scoffed. We know the road, and what walks it. We've all walked it, she said, meeting his eyes. The room grew still. She did not mean to defend the strangers, but she could not bring herself to assume their cruelty. They too might have lost homes, families, names. They too might be wandering in search of something more than spoils. Still, hope did not mean foolishness, so the council prepared. Supplies were moved to the root cellar beneath the old manor. The chapel bell, still frozen with silence, was inspected, the ropes untangled. It had not rung in a year, but perhaps it might ring again if warning was needed. Ellen walked the road alone at dawn, her feet steady despite the tremble in her heart. She reached the crossroads, where the path from Firlcombe met the Roman remnants of an older way, now little more than a moss-covered lane. There, in the ash of an extinguished fire, she found a sigil scratched into the dirt. 3 slashes, 1 long, 2 short. It meant nothing to her, but it was deliberate. She returned quickly, the wind cold against her back. They were here, she said to Tom. They marked the ground, his mouth pressed into a line. We post watches, he replied, night and day, and if they come, she said, we meet them. The next day, the fire returned, this time closer. At the edge of the southern field, a black pillar of smoke rose, not wide, no house ablaze, but tall, sharp, controlled. A signal or a challenge. Aldous was the one to spot them first. 4 figures, one with a red cloak, one limping, one holding a long spear. They did not enter the village. They stood at the edge, watching, waiting. Ellen approached. Alone. Tom shouted. Others cried protest. But she raised her hand and walked into the spring, wind with nothing in her arms but a loaf of coarse oat bread wrapped in cloth. The strangers did not move. She stopped 10 paces away. I am Ellen, she said, of Thistlebrook. The one in the red cloak stepped forward. He was tall, sunburnt, with lines etched deep into his brow. His eyes were sharp, but not unkind. Then you are brave, he said, or foolish. Sometimes both. He tilted, his head. We seek no trouble. Then come without blades, she answered, and sit at our fire. There was silence. Then he smiled. It was a weary, bent thing, but it held no malice. He turned to his companions. Lay the arms, he said. One by one they did. Knives, the spear, a short bow with a snapped string. Ellen led them into the village as the sky darkened behind them. The strangers gave names: Roth, Marek, Old Nim, and a woman called Della who carried a child in a sling. They were not raiders. They were not saints either. Just survivors, like Thistlebrook, worn raw by the world. They told stories of towns where people had turned to cannibalism, of lords who claimed whole valleys as their own and burned those who resisted, of children born after the plague who never learned to laugh. Ellen listened. So did Tom. So did Aldous, perched quietly beside the chapel window. Later, when the strangers slept in the granary, warm and fed, Ellen turned to the fire and murmured, "We cannot remain alone." Cecily, who had said little, finally nodded. Roads must open again, even if they brought danger, even if they brought fire. The next morning, the bell rang. Not a warning, not a funeral toll, just one clear note, like a breath returning after a long-held silence. And so, the village remembered. To survive the plague had been terrible, but to live in its shadow, with roads reopened and trust reborn, that too carried its own perils. In a world newly stitched together by caution and ash, hospitality was a currency both sacred and dangerous. Before the plague, it had been a given, unspoken but practiced. A crust of bread for the traveller, a place by the hearth for a wandering monk, a cup of ale shared with the next soul to pass through the village gate. Such offerings were seen not as favours, but as duty, as threads binding the great tapestry of Christian charity and neighbourly bond. But now, things were different. When Roth and his companions first entered Thistlebrook, they had been guests, fed, watched, tolerated. By the end of the first fortnight, they had become something else, not quite kin, not quite strangers, something in between. Ellen watched them carefully, not from distrust, but from understanding. Grief lived in each of them, hidden behind the small acts of politeness and shared labour. Roth, the red-cloaked leader, had a son once, lost to fever in a nameless inn before winter. Della, the woman with the child, had not spoken her husband's name since her arrival. Marek and Nim were too thin, their eyes too restless, hands always close to their belts, even in sleep. They helped. Roth mended fences. Marek fetched water. Della shared what seeds she carried sewn into the hems of her tunic. They gave more than they took, at least at first. But the villagers watched with quiet unease. Thistlebrook had grown used to stillness, predictability, the cadence of a new, delicate rhythm. The arrival of outsiders, however peaceable, disrupted it. Cecily warned first. "They do not know our dead," she said one night, stirring the evening gruel. "They did not stand at the pits. Their roots lie elsewhere." "We all came from elsewhere," Ellen answered. "But grief," Cecily replied, "is a kind of home. And theirs is not ours. It was not unkindness, only truth. Still, the trouble came not from violence, but from need. It began with a cart. Old Nim took it, without permission. He needed it, he claimed, to fetch firewood beyond the ridge. He'd meant to return it truly, but the axle cracked, and when Tom found it half buried in mud 3 miles west, he brought back more than the cart. He brought suspicion. Nim apologized. He even wept. But something had shifted. The next morning, Tom found a knife missing from the chapel stores, then a sack of oats, then 2 lengths of good rope. Nothing large, but the kind of small thefts that wore at trust like dripping water on stone. Ellen convened the council. They sat in the rectory, the air heavy with the scent of tallow smoke and sour cheese. She had hoped the meeting would be calm, reasoned. It was not. "We cannot feed 4 more mouths all summer," one man said. "They bring no livestock, no grain, no kin. They'll call more like them. This is how rot begins. They speak to the boy, Aldous, when no one's listening. Ellen held up her hands. "They have helped," she said. "They've asked for nothing beyond food and shelter." "They have taken," someone muttered. "They have survived," she corrected. "As we have." That silenced the room. Still, fear brewed quietly beneath every word. She visited Roth that evening. He sat on the steps of the granary, sharpening a blade that was more rust than steel. The firelight danced across his face, revealing a new weariness. "You've heard," he said. She nodded. "I thought it would last longer," he said. "What?" "The peace." Ellen sat beside him. "Peace," she said softly, "was never meant to last. It must be chosen. Again and again." He looked at her. "You think we threaten it?" "I think we all do," she replied. "Every one of us, every day." He set the blade down. "I'll speak to my people," he said. It's time for us to move." "No," she interrupted. "Not yet, but something must change." So they made a pact. Each guest was assigned a task. Marek would patrol the southern ridge, watchful for other wanderers. Nim would serve meals, never first, never last. Della would tend the chapel garden, and in return, Cecily would teach her the uses of herb and root, and Roth he would build. They needed shelters, stables, pens, structures to replace the sagging wood and empty homes of the dead. He would do it, not for payment, but to earn his place. The pact was spoken beneath the chapel arch with hands laid on the altar stone and no priest to sanctify it, just the flame of the Virgin, steady and watching. The days that followed were better. Roth dug post holes with bare hands. Marek found an old stag's skull and mounted it above the watch hut, a totem, perhaps, or warning. Nim became quiet, deferent. Della smiled once while stringing beans. Ellen breathed easier until the traveller came. He arrived alone, thin, bent, cloaked in a coat too fine for his boots. He called himself Bayard, and his accent was courtly, too much so. He spoke like a man used to being listened to, and listened he was. He told tales of cities reawakening, of London coughing back to life, of markets returning, of bishops rebuilding their flocks, of nobles desperate for labour to till their lands again. "There is gold," he said, "for those who travel. Bread," he said, "and favour." He watched Thistlebrook like a merchant eyes a horse, appraising. Roth didn't trust him, neither did Tom, but others listened, especially the young. When Bayard left, 4 went with him, 2 boys, barely 16, 1 girl, newly widowed, and Marek, Ellen, watched them disappear down the stranger's road, and in her heart she felt a familiar ache. Survival demanded trust, but trust had teeth. That night, Della lit 2 candles at the chapel, one for the travellers and one for those who stayed behind. In silence, the village gathered. They said nothing, only watched the flames sway, like hope caught in wind. And Ellen wrote in her ledger, "To open the prone door is to risk the wind, but to close it forever is to choose death in another form." By the summer of 1349, Thistlebrook had begun to look alive again, not vibrant, not joyous, but alive. Beans climbed their poles beside the chapel. Chickens clucked in half-mended pens. Smoke rose from hearths not just in hunger, but in industry. There were loaves in ovens, cloth on looms, tools sharpened against new ironstones found in the south fields. For the first time in nearly a year, the village could breathe without coughing on ash. But some things had not returned. Chief among them, childhood. It was Aldous who first made Ellen realize it. He had grown taller, his limbs no longer soft with youth, but angular, wiry. His feet were perpetually bare, his hair knotted with twigs. He never spoke, but his eyes followed everything. Every tool sharpened, every path walked, every whispered meeting of the council behind the rectory. He was not a boy anymore. None of them were. Of the children who had survived the plague, fewer than a dozen remained in Thistlebrook. Each one changed. None played. Not truly. Not with the reckless abandon of years before. There were no games of stickstone, no chases around the mill pond, no contests to see who could climb the elder tree fastest. Their laughter was rare and brittle, like porcelain set too close to the fire. They worked now, not from cruelty, but from necessity. Children gathered herbs, drew water, carried messages between houses. They learned to dig, to sow, to gather eggs without cracking them. There were no longer separate worlds of child and adult. There was only survival, and all had their role to play. One girl, Joan, 8 years old and the sole survivor of a family of 7, had taken to keeping the chapel floor clean. She swept it with a broom fashioned from goose feathers and sang, under her breath, not songs of play, but hymns too old for her years. Ellen watched her one morning, the girl's shoulders moving rhythmically, her face solemn. "She has her mother's hands," Cecily murmured beside her, "but not her childhood." That evening, the council met to speak of the children, a rare thing. So many other needs took precedence: crop rotation, tool maintenance, dealings with new wanderers. But Tom, for once, had insisted. "They do not dream," he said simply, and no one argued. They tried. They truly did. They organized a festival, not as before, with music and dancing and the juggler from Eastleigh, but a modest celebration, a midsummer circle, wreaths of lavender and rosemary, a loaf blessed by Cecily and shared beneath the lime tree. The children came. They stood in rows, hands stiff at their sides. Some smiled, most did not. Even Aldous refused the berry wine. Ellen knelt beside him, offered a wooden flute once carved by the late Cooper. He touched it, briefly, but then pushed it away. That night, she could not sleep. She wandered the chapel alone, the candle in her hand, trembling slightly, its flame catching on the old wall paintings, now faded to ghost forms. Saints blurred by smoke, angels with missing wings. She stopped at the Virgin, spoke aloud. "I don't know how to bring them back." The silence that followed was vast, but not empty. Outside the chapel, the stars blinked like the watchful eyes of things older than memory, and, still, no answer. The next morning, she tried something different. She gathered the children, not in the chapel, not in the square, but at the edge of the plague field. There, where the earth rose unevenly, she knelt and began to dig. A small hole. Nothing deep, nothing solemn, just enough for a sapling. An apple seedling barely 2 hands high. The children watched, puzzled. "This tree," she said, brushing soil from her fingers, "will bear fruit long after I am dead, but not unless it takes root." Aldous frowned. "But it's yours," said Joan. Ellen smiled. "No, it's yours." She stepped back, waited. Joan came forward first, pressed a handful of dirt into the hole, then Aldous. Then 2 more. The others followed. They did not laugh. They did not sing. But when the tree was planted, they stood in a circle around it, and for a moment, Ellen could almost feel something thaw. That night, she asked Cecily to begin teaching again. Not herbs, not healing, but stories. Tales of saints, of forgotten kings, of foolish knights and clever maidens, even fairy tales, Cecily had asked, one eyebrow raised. "Especially fairy tales," Ellen said. They lit a fire at dusk, sat beneath the stars, and Cecily told the tale of the girl who caught the moon in a jar, and how she let it out again when she learned that even light must be shared. The children listened. Some fell asleep. Some asked questions. Aldous stayed awake the longest. When the fire died down, he took the flute Ellen had offered him days before, and though he didn't blow a note, he cradled it in his lap like a relic. The next evening, they gathered again. This time, Joan brought a ribbon. The evening after that, another child brought a frog. Another, a song half remembered from her mother's mouth. Piece by piece, something returned. Not play, not innocence, but something like wonder. And in a village shaped by sorrow, that was no small miracle. Ellen wrote in her ledger, "Grief made them grow too fast. But perhaps stories can teach them how to be young again, even for a moment." In the coming weeks, the children spoke more. They planted herbs with Cecily, carved toys from fallen branches, painted the chapel stones with berry juice and crushed petals. Aldous whittled a bird. No one asked what kind, but everyone agreed it looked ready to fly. The dead had been buried. The sickness had passed. But it was the living who carried the heaviest weight. They bore it not in coffins, but in memory. Not in silence, but in the awkward pauses between conversations, in the glances shared during mealtimes, in the dreams they dared not speak aloud. Ellen saw it clearest in the eyes of Tom. He had not lost his strength. His hammer still rang out in the mornings as he shaped metal with steady hands. But something in him had quieted. He no longer whistled while he worked, no longer told the stories of his youth, of midsummer tournaments and long-vanished loves. He moved through the village like a man made of stone, solid, necessary, and silent. It was Cecily who said it first. "We've all been holding our breath," she murmured one morning as she ground dried thyme in her mortar. "And now that we can breathe again, none of us knows how." The plague had taken half the village, but the half that remained were like pages half burned, still legible, still present, but marked by fire. Every task reminded them of what had once been done by other hands. Every joy arrived with a shadow. That summer, a child was born, the first since the plague. Della, the wanderer with the quiet eyes, gave birth on a fog-drenched morning in late July, in the cool stone shade of the chapel, with Cecily and Ellen beside her. The labour was long, the cries muted, but the child arrived breathing, red-faced and perfect. They named him Thomas, not for the blacksmith, though he wept when he heard it, but for the apostle, the doubter. "We all doubted," Della whispered, pressing her forehead to her newborns. "And yet, here we are." The village rejoiced quietly. There were no feasts, no dancing, no trumpets. Only warm bread passed from hand to hand. A cradle lined with wool. A ribbon tied around the chapel door. And a dozen candles lit that night beneath the Virgin's gaze, their flames flickering with a kind of tentative hope. Ellen watched them burn and felt something shift inside her. Not relief, not celebration, but permission. Permission to hope. Permission to remember joy without guilt. Still, not all carried their grief so gracefully. Gareth, once a tanner's apprentice, had grown more distant with each passing season. He rarely spoke, ate alone, walked the outskirts of the village like a ghost bound to its border. He had lost his brother, his mother, and his betrothed within days of each other during the height of the plague. What remained of him was a shell, stitched together by routine and stubborn breath. One day, he vanished. Left behind no note, no farewell, only his boots by the well, and a length of frayed rope coiled like a question mark beside them. They searched the woods, the riverbanks, the plague pit. But he was gone. It was Aldous who found the message, etched into the inside wall of the old tannery, hidden beneath layers of drying hide. "I could not carry it any longer." Ellen traced the words with her fingers, her heart hollowing. She gathered the village that evening, not in panic, not in anger, but in mourning, for Gareth, and for the silent burdens they all still bore. "We have spoken the names of the dead," she said, standing before the chapel, "but we must now speak of the living, of those among us who suffer still, even in the light." She paused, looked at their faces, weathered, weary, watching. "We do not need only bread and tools and shelter. We need each other, not in silence, not in guilt, but in truth." She took out the ledger, and for the first time, she read aloud not the record of goods, but the record of hearts, births, deaths, disputes resolved, kindnesses given, names remembered, moments recorded, not for judgment, but for witness. And when she finished, no one clapped. They simply stood. Some held hands, others cried, a few smiled. And when the candles were lit that night, they burned, not just for the plague dead, but for the weary living. Afterward, something changed in Thistlebrook. It was subtle, but it mattered. People began checking on one another more deliberately. Meals were taken together more often, even when there wasn't enough to satisfy. Work was shared more equally, regardless of age or skill. And most importantly, space was made for grief, for rest, for confession. Cecily began holding quiet hours in the chapel twice a week. No sermons, no prayers, just space, a bench, a blanket, a place to sit in silence with another soul. The first time Tom went, he sat for hours without a word. When he rose, he only said, "I forgot what it felt like to be still without hurting." Others followed. Not every soul was healed. Grief is not a fever. It does not break and pass, but it no longer ruled them. It lived among them, as it always had, but they began to carry it together, and in that, they found strength. Ellen wrote in her ledger, "We were never meant to bear this alone. The plague scattered us, but the burden of survival is what will remake us, if we let each other in." As summer deepened, new voices rose in the village. Not always cheerful, but true, and that truth, shared, was how Thistlebrook learned to be not only a village that had survived, but a village that could live. The crows returned before the tacksmen did. They came in flocks, black smudges in the sky, feathered sentinels perched upon rooftops, chapel spires, and fence posts. In the years before the plague, villagers might have shooed them off with clapping, hands, and muttered charms. But now, no one bothered. Crows had been faithful companions through the dying, feeders of carrion, keepers of silence, black-winged witnesses to every unmarked grave. Now they came not for the dead, but for the living, and they brought omens. One morning, Ellen awoke to find 7 crows arrayed on her windowsill, all facing inward, all still. She blinked, breathed, watched. They flew away as one, like ink spilled across parchment sky. She said nothing, but lit a candle beside the Virgin that morning and whispered no particular prayer, only a wordless breath of caution. 3 days later, the riders came, not armed soldiers, not raiders, but something colder. Men in faded blue with parchment pouches and wax-sealed tablets dangling from their belts. Their horses were lean, their boots shined, their hands uncalloused. They bore no swords, but they bore scrolls, and that was a sharper threat. The king's men, tacksmen, collectors of dues, long delayed. Thistlebrook had not seen a royal agent in over a year, since the sickness, since order collapsed and the manor's steward fled his post, since the land forgot its lord and the people turned inward to their own survival. But the crown had not forgotten. They came with lists, records written long ago, before half the names had turned to ash. They demanded figures, bushels, hides, hen's pence. They asked after the reeve. They asked after the manor house. They asked after the mill that no longer turned. They asked for the dead to pay their share. Ellen stood before them, with her ledger open and her shoulders drawn high. "There is no reeve," she said. "Then who speaks for Thistlebrook?" She hesitated. "We have a council." "A council is not a crown's appointment. It is what remains." The men exchanged glances. Their leader, a narrow-faced clerk with a quill tucked behind one ear, sniffed disdainfully. "Then we must appoint a steward until His Majesty's wishes are known." "We have barely fed our children," Ellen said quietly. "There is no surplus here, only survival." He waved a parchment in reply. "The crown has debts too. War does not pause for plague." The words hung in the air like smoke. War. It was the first time in months anyone had spoken it aloud. Somewhere, out beyond the hills and hedgerows, the world still fought itself. France, Scotland, Wales, the games of kings played on the backs of men too tired to lift a sword. The tacksmen stayed 3 days. They took nothing at first, but they measured. They counted goats, weighed sacks of grain, catalogued every usable tool. They noted names, Ellen, Tom, Cecily, and scribbled them with tight, ink-stained fingers. Then they left, promising to return before the harvest. Their silence was heavier than their threats. That night, no fires were lit, no stories told. The crows returned, circling above the granary like priests at a funeral. "We have no coin," Tom muttered the next day. "No livestock to spare." "They'll take what they want," Cecily said. "If not now, then later." "They'll send others," Ellen added, "with writs and orders and armour if they must." "What do we do?" Aldous asked softly, his first spoken words in days. Ellen looked out at the gathered faces, then down at her hands. She had written their stories, preserved their names, but parchment could not protect them from a crown too distant. To see them as people. "We prepare," she said. But what did that mean? They were not rebels. They were not warriors. They were survivors, weary, underfed, clinging to one another like shipwrecked sailors in a tide they did not choose. Yet something changed after the tacksmen left. They became alert again, not fearful, not resigned, but aware. Gareth's disappearance, Marrick's departure, Roth's uncertainty. The plague had hollowed them, but the crown would weigh their bones in scales of silver. So they began to plan, not for revolt, but for endurance. Tom began forging anew, not weapons, but locks, hinges, hidden compartments in carts, reinforced, doors on the granary and chapel. Cecily buried their finest herbs in clay jars marked only by a single stone, Della dried roots and preserved milk in salt. Ellen rewrote the ledger, not the one she shared, but a second, hidden copy, where she noted not only what they had, but what they could lose. They marked trails in the forest, paths known only to Aldous and the children, quick ways to flee or hide if pressed. They spoke little of it during daylight, but at night, in the hush after meals, they taught one another how to vanish if they must, not because they wished to, but because they had learned. Survival is not only breath and bread, it is knowing how to disappear when power forgets your humanity. And the crows kept watch, ever circling, ever calling. One morning, a feather appeared on the altar, jet black, placed at the Virgin's feet. No, one claimed it. No one removed it. Ellen left it there, a silent testament, a warning, and a vow. If the world meant to measure their worth in coin and wheat alone, then it would do so through smoke and shadow, through ledgers written in 2 hands. And when the tacksmen returned, if they returned, they would find a village not bowed, but prepared. A village that remembered. A village not just of survivors, but of those who had learned how to endure. Summer waned. The heat softened. The fields, once golden, took on the weary bronze of late August, and all of Thistlebrook seemed to hold its breath. The villagers called it the still time. It was a season when no birds sang at dawn. The orchard crows, once ever watchful, now sat quietly on roof beams, as if they too waited for something unnamed. Even the breeze that passed through the hedgerows moved more cautiously, stirring leaves with a kind of reverent restraint. Nothing was wrong, but everything was heavy. Ellen noticed it most in the faces of the children. They played less, laughed less. Joan had stopped singing altogether, and Aldous had taken to spending whole afternoons staring at the bend in the road, where the hills swallowed the path to Firlcombe. He had carved another bird, this one smaller, sharper, with wings tucked back and a beak open as if mid-cry. She asked what kind it was. "Not a bird," he whispered. A warning. Ellen kept it by her bed. The council met twice as often now. They had little new to discuss, No crisis, no sudden blight or injury, but still they met, because routine had become their shield. Cecily said it best. We don't meet to decide. We meet so we remember that we still can. They planned for the harvest, even though the earth had been unkind. The beans were thin, the barley patchy. The apples had come early, then vanished. Too much rain in spring. Too little now, but still, there was enough to stretch, if no one took more than their share. The memory of the tacksmen lingered. No one spoke of them aloud, but their presence hovered in every decision. When food was gathered, it was done quietly. When tools were counted, they were recorded twice. Once for the village, once for the day they might be demanded by men with soft hands and hard faces. One afternoon, a flock of geese passed overhead, dozens of them, their cries loud, insistent, echoing down the valley like a call to arms. Everyone looked up. No one spoke. Even the children stood still, their eyes following the pale undersides of wings as they vanished southward. Ellen felt something clench in her chest, not fear, not quite, but a knowing. It was Tom who broke the silence first that week. He stood in the square, hammer in hand, eyes tired. If they come again, he said, we must decide now what we'll give, and what we won't. The villagers gathered around him, forming an uneven circle. No one questioned who they were. We'll give grain, said Cecily after a pause. Some. What we can. We can spare half a goat, murmured Della. No more. We cannot give the children, Ellen said. That startled them, but she pressed on. They'll ask for workers, for hands, for sons, maybe daughters. Her voice grew quieter. We must decide now that the answer is no. There was a long silence, then Tom nodded. Aye. Others echoed him, one by one. Even those who said nothing pressed their heels into the earth a little more firmly, as though trying to root themselves against the tide to come. Ellen did not sleep that night. She sat by the window, the carved warning bird in her lap, and watched the road. There was nothing. Only mist, and the memory of hoofprints. 3 days later, a man arrived, alone. He wore no seal, no badge, only travel-worn boots and a cloak dusted with wheat husks. He carried no sword, only a walking staff bound with iron rings. He came at dawn, did not knock. He stood in the square and waited until someone noticed. It was Joan who found him first, the hem of her dress still damp from the dew. She ran to fetch Ellen. By the time the village had gathered, the man had sat on the edge of the well, hands folded, head bowed. I am called Brother Rowlin, he said, rising slowly. I bring word, not demand. He did not look dangerous, but neither did he look harmless. He looked tired. We've had enough of both, Tom said. Rowlin nodded. So have I. He spoke quietly, patiently, and never raised his voice. He said he had come from Exeter, that the plague had broken the old bishopric, and a dozen new orders had sprung up like mushrooms in the rot, that he now served one such order, a brotherhood of record, of reconciliation, tasked by the crown not to collect, but to count. I am not here to take, he said, only to witness. Why? Asked Aldous, his voice thin. Rowland turned toward him. Because no one believes you're still here. The words stung, but they were not wrong. No tallyman had reached Thistlebrook. No scribe had recorded their dead. The manor had fallen silent, and in a world rebuilding through letters and ledgers, those not named did not exist. You are ghosts, Rowland said softly. Living ones, but ghosts nonetheless. And what happens? Asked Ellen. Once we're counted. Rowland paused. Then, that depends on who's reading. He stayed 3 days. He walked the village, wrote notes, recorded births, recorded the names of the dead, the number of chickens, the number of ploughshares. He asked questions about the plague year, and though some hesitated, many answered, because part of them wanted to be known again. Before he left, he stood in the chapel and offered a prayer, not to a saint, but to the keepers of memory. And he left a promise that others may come, not to rule, not to take, but to witness. The village did not cheer, but they did not close their doors either. The silence returned after he left, but it was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence before something new. Not peace, not danger, but change. The first letter arrived on a windless morning, bound in oilskin and tied with flaxen cord. It bore no seal, no wax crest, only a name, Ellen of Thistlebrook, written in a careful, spidery hand. The boy who carried it had no idea from whom it came. He had found it tucked in the cleft of a tree 2 villages west, left there with 3 others bearing different names. He'd been promised a loaf of barley bread and a place to sleep for every letter he delivered. He did not ask what the letter contained. He did not need to. In a world where parchment had once been rarer than coin, and the act of writing was the domain of monks and stewards, a letter was more than communication. It was validation. A proof that somewhere, beyond the valley and hills, someone still knew your name. Ellen read it beneath the old lime tree, her knees drawn close to her chest. It was from a woman named Magda. She lived in a village called Wittering-on-Weald, where the plague had taken all but 11. She had been the reeve's wife once. Now she described herself only as a caretaker of memory. Her letter was not long. It spoke of the first frost, of the return of foxes, of a boy who carved, stories into bark with a fishbone, and it ended with this: "We are told that survival is a matter of flesh, but I believe it is a matter of name. If you know mine now, then I am still real. And if I know yours, then so are you." Ellen folded the letter as if it was spun from gold. Then she cried, not from sorrow, not even from joy, but from recognition. She gathered the village that night, not for crisis, not for counsel, but for something older. A reading. The people sat in uneven rows in the chapel, lit by beeswax and tallow, their hands clasped in silence as Ellen read Magda's letter aloud. Her voice trembled at first, but steadied with each word. By the end, even Tom had bowed his head. They passed the letter from hand to hand, each person holding it for a moment, some tracing the letters with reverent fingers, as if touching the skin of a long-lost friend. Then came the idea they would write back, not just to Magda, to others, to any who still had ears and breath and ink enough to care. The next morning, Ellen, Cecily, and Della sat at a makeshift desk by the chapel window. They pulled what scraps they had: old church records, the backs of forgotten sermons, the blank sides of abandoned account books. Ink was scarce. Cecily ground it from burnt hawthorn and the dregs of last year's berries. They wrote slowly, carefully. Each letter bore the mark of hands that had tilled soil, mended cloth, buried kin. They told the truth, of how the field struggled, of how Aldous had carved his 6th bird, of the chapel's virgin, still missing her right hand, but now wrapped in a garland of time. They wrote of grief, of Tom's quietness, of Joan's sweeping songs, of Gareth, whose boots had never been claimed, and they asked nothing in return, only that if someone read the words, they might write back. They sent the letters with peddlers and pilgrims, with travelling friars and quiet wanderers. Some were given to shepherds, some left at wayposts. They were seeds cast into wind, uncertain of soil. Then came the waiting and the wondering. Would the words return? The first reply came 2 weeks later, then another and another. Letters from Woodmere, from Farthing's Hollow, from the burnt shell of a monastery, where only 2 novices remained. They arrived folded, sometimes rain-stained, sometimes smudged, but every one a lifeline. Some were confessions, some simple reports, some desperate prayers, but each held a voice, a soul, a name. Ellen created a ledger for them, not one of goods, but of words. She listed the villages, The names, the tone of each message, joyous, sorrowed, quiet, angry. She wrote excerpts on the chapel wall so that all could read them. I have only one tooth but chew my bread like a king. Our pigs eat better than we do, but they don't complain. We sing to the moon because the sun feels too distant. They became a kind of scripture. Evening gatherings became readings. Children copied phrases into the dirt with sticks. Joan began writing her own stories, folded and left beside the Virgin, waiting for some unseen reader to find them. The letters changed everything, not in the fields, not in the bellies, but in the heart. Before, Thistlebrook had endured. Now, it began to belong to something wider, greater. It was no longer alone. Each parchment carried the scent of another fire, the breath of another mourner, the ink of another village that still dared to speak. And with each letter, they learned. They learned how others cured meat with bark smoke, how some stilled coughs with boiled nettles, how one town survived a famine by eating moss fried in lard. They shared remedies, traditions, jokes, and names. So many names, each one spoken aloud in the chapel, each one carved on the back of the pews by Aldous, who never asked permission and was never stopped. Even Tom began to write, slowly, haltingly. A short note sent to a place called Bracken Hill. I am still here, it read. Nothing more. But it was enough, and when a reply came, it bore a single sentence. So am I. Ellen kept that one beside her bed, wrapped in wool, and she wrote in the ledger, before the plague, letters belonged to monks and lords. Now they belong to the broken-hearted, and perhaps that is where they always should have lived. When the next traveller came, he carried a satchel of letters bound with twine, and he asked, "Which of you is Ellen?" 10 hands rose, not from pride, but from kinship, and that too was a kind of survival. By the end of the second autumn after the plague, Thistlebrook received its first invitation. It came not on parchment, but on linen, stitched in red thread by a woman from a village called Penmere. A square of cloth, carefully folded, delivered by a travelling spinner with a pack twice her size and eyes that had seen too much. The cloth read, "To the villagers who remember, a market is to be held, 2 days past Michaelmas, on the green at Lowmarsh. Goods, songs, tales, masks welcome. Bring only what you do not fear to lose." It was a strange message, but nothing was stranger than peace, and peace had lingered longer than any dared expect. The tacksman had not returned. The crows had grown quiet. The children had begun to sing again. And so, after much discussion, some cautious, some hopeful, it was agreed. Thistlebrook would send a party to the market. Ellen would go. So would Tom, with his iron tools wrapped in cloth. Cecily, bearing dried roots and tinctures. Della, to trade wool and perhaps learn news of Marek, who had vanished so many moons before, and Aldous, not as a child, but as a carver of birds, now numbering 12. They prepared not with fanfare, but with solemn care. Bundles of herbs, pouches of salt, a dozen eggs, bartered from a hen that still laid like it remembered spring, and letters, so many letters, written by children and elders alike, to be carried, exchanged, released into the wider world like ships set adrift on paper sails. Ellen wrote her own, to the one who remembers the smell of wood smoke after rain, to the one who sang during the silence. I do not know your name, but I think I have always known your sorrow. May this market find you kind. They left before dawn on the appointed day, the cart creaking beneath its load, the roads soft with dew. Thistlebrook watched them go. No one waved, but the Virgin wore a garland of fresh thyme, and someone had placed a painted stone at the crossroads, marked with a single word, return. The journey took 2 days. 2 days of hedgerows and mossy tracks, of forgotten shrines and half-fallen bridges, of deer seen at dusk and owls heard at dawn. Low Marsh was no longer low, nor quite a marsh. It had drained somewhat under the watch of a dozen surviving families who had tilled its stubborn soil and strung cloth between the trees like prayer flags. When Thistlebrook arrived, they found the market already blooming, not with gold or coins, but with stories, faces, offerings. Stalls made of old carts, blankets laid over stone, fire pits ringed, with bread loaves, and above all the people, so many people, more than Ellen had seen gathered in a single place since before the world ended. They wore masks, some simple, linen veils, painted strips of bark, others elaborate, feathers, bone, carved wood with eyes that wept wax. It was a tradition born of both reverence and fear, a custom carried over from the height of the plague, when to see another's face was to gamble with death. Now it remained as memory, not of fear, but of remembrance. "We wear them," said a boy with a goat horn mask, "so our dead can join us without shame." Ellen felt a chill run down her spine. She tied her mask on slowly, a plain one, dyed with walnut ink, embroidered at the edges with tiny spirals by Joan's careful hand. She looked to Aldous. He wore no mask, just a carving strung around his neck, his smallest bird yet, wings outstretched. "No one sees me anyway," he said. The market opened with song, not by minstrels, but by everyone. A single note hummed and passed from mouth to mouth like a flame catching kindling. It filled the green, it rose through the boughs, and when it faded, silence felt like a gift. Thistlebrook set up their stall beneath a half-dead chestnut tree. Ellen laid out the letters. Cecily arranged her jars. Tom placed his iron goods on a cloth marked with a crow. And Della, quietly, strung woolen threads across a spindle and offered it to a woman who had not spoken since the death of her daughter. A trade was made, not in coin, but in value. Stories for bread, laughs for candles, an old recipe for a new blanket. Ellen watched it all and felt, for the first time in years, full, not with food, but with presence. She met a woman from Yarrow Fen who still dreamed of the dead and painted their names on shells. A man from Stoneford who sang lullabies in 3 languages. A child who recited a poem to a tree and claimed it bloomed earlier each spring as thanks. There were no guards, no collectors, only people. People who had survived, who had endured, who now dared to create something together, if only for a day. At dusk, lanterns were lit, not just for light, but for memory. Each was named, held, lifted, released. One for every village, every loss, every letter never answered. Aldous made no speech, but he carved a tiny flute that night and placed it beneath a tree. The next morning, it was gone. In its place, a note. "I dreamed in birdsong again. Thank you." When the market ended, no one said farewell. Only until, because partings now were too permanent. Thistlebrook returned on foot, the cart lighter, their hearts heavier, but not in grief. In meaning, Ellen opened her ledger. Wrote, "Only this, a mask can hide, but it can also protect what's still becoming." And on the chapel wall, someone etched new words beneath the Virgin's hand. "We trade not just in goods, but in the courage to be seen again." The well in Thistlebrook had been dug long before anyone alive could remember. It stood at the centre of the village square, ringed by mossy stones and crowned with a wooden roof so warped it leaned sideways like a tired man in prayer. Its rope had been replaced many times. Its bucket, patched and repatched, bore the scars of 100 seasons. It had given water through drought, flood, and plague. It had quenched the thirst of lovers, livestock, mourners, and midwives. It had always given, until it didn't. Ellen was the first to notice. She rose before the sun, as was her custom, to draw water for the morning bread. The air was still cool, the grass wet beneath her feet. She pulled the rope once, twice, and felt only the weight of emptiness. No splash, no echo. She peered inside. Darkness, dry. She said nothing at first. She drew water from the stream instead. Farther off, muddier, colder, but sufficient for kneading, she told herself it might return. That perhaps the water table had shifted. That perhaps the bucket had tilted and missed its mark. But by noon, word had spread. Tom confirmed it. So did Della. Even Aldous, quiet as he was, stood beside the stones and stared down into the dry dark, his carved bird held tightly in both hands. The well had run dry, and with it came unease. Not panic, not yet, but a quiet unravelling of certainty. "We've always had it," Cecily said, pacing beneath the chapel eaves. "Even during the hot years, even when the river froze." "We've still the stream," Tom offered, though his voice was low, uncertain. "The stream floods," Della reminded, "and it fouls easily." Ellen sat alone with the ledger that night, pen trembling. She didn't write statistics, she wrote feelings. The village holds its breath again, not from plague, not from man, but from the earth itself. It is a strange kind of fear, to be betrayed by the ground. In the days that followed, the stream grew crowded. The walk there, once a peaceful task for 2 or 3, became a daily procession. Buckets, jars, clay pitchers balanced on shoulders, children carrying sloshing gourds. The stream gurgled on, indifferent to the weight now placed upon it. Cecily boiled everything, even water for washing. Sickness, she reminded them, was no longer an enemy they could afford to forget. The council met daily now, seated on upturned crates behind the chapel, their brows furrowed beneath the golden droop of early autumn. "We dig deeper," Tom said. "And risk collapse," Cecily countered. "We build a cistern," Della suggested. "Catch the rain and pray the skies don't dry too." They argued, gently but firmly. No one had answers, only possibilities. Ellen found herself returning to the well each morning, as if to check whether it had changed its mind. She lowered the bucket slowly, carefully, listening, but always silence, until one morning there was sound, not water, not the familiar splash and echo, but something else. Breath, soft, ragged. She startled, peered down. "Who's there?" No answer, but again, the breath, a presence. She stepped back, heart thudding. Ran to fetch Tom. He came with rope and a torch. They lowered the flame into the shaft slowly, cautiously, and there, crumpled against the stones, no more than 10 feet, down, a boy, thin, filthy, barely breathing. They hauled him up with care, his limbs limp, his mouth cracked and crusted. He was not from Thistlebrook. His hair was too fair, his clothes too strange. He wore a pendant carved from bone, 3 circles interlocked, and on his chest, beneath the grime, a mark had been burned into the skin. A brand, the letter M, cruel and uneven. He did not speak, not for 2 days. They fed him broth, let him sleep, on straw, washed his wounds with nettle water and thyme. He flinched at every sound, every hand, but did not flee. When he finally spoke, it was one word, mine. They did not know what he meant. He said it again, when asked his name. Mine. A name, a warning, a memory, a curse? They did not know, but they named him mine, spelled softer, said gentler. He did not smile, but he nodded, and slowly he began to stay. He would not leave the chapel. He slept beneath the Virgin, hands folded over, his chest, as if afraid the floor might vanish beneath him. Joan gave him a blanket. Aldous, a carving. Even Tom left a slice of apple bread at his side one night, though he said nothing. The well remained dry, but something else began to flow. Stories. Not from mine, He remained mostly silent, but from the villagers, about other wells gone dry, about children disappearing, about brands and marks and whispers in the woods. They realized then this was not a curse of drought. It was something older, darker, perhaps even man-made. Ellen did not speak of it openly, but she began gathering the stories in a separate ledger. She titled it The Book of Echoes, and, with each entry, she lit a small candle in the chapel, not in fear, but in witness. The well had given water once. Now it gave truth. Painful, mysterious, but truth nonetheless. And when Ellen returned one evening and found Mine sitting beside the empty stones, whispering softly into the dark, she did not interrupt. She only sat beside him and waited. Because sometimes survival was not in the answers, it was in the listening. It began with a single line of smoke, thin and grey, curling above the treetops to the east. No fire had been lit in that direction for months, not since the woodcutters abandoned the old timber trail, and even then, they burned little. The trees beyond were dense, tangled with bramble and foxglove, hiding paths known only to the oldest hunters. The land was rarely walked, but on that morning, the smoke stood still. Ellen saw it first from the chapel roof, where she had gone to clean moss. From the eaves, the line wavered gently in the breeze, as though unsure if it belonged in this world at all. By the time she climbed down, 3 others had seen it too. "We should send someone," Tom said, his voice like gravel in water. "Not alone," Cecily countered. So they chose a party of 4. Ellen, Tom, Aldous, who had insisted silently by standing beside her and refusing to leave, and a man named Corwin, a traveller who had arrived weeks before, quiet and broad-shouldered, who said little but repaired roofs with the ease of long habit. They left at midday. The forest swallowed them quickly. The trees were tall here, ash, elm, yew, interwoven like the ribs of giants. The air was cooler, damper, heavy with rot and old life. Thorned vines tugged at cloaks, and squirrels chattered angrily from high perches. No birds sang. After an hour, they found the first sign. Scrap of cloth caught on a bramble, red, torn, crusted with something dark. Not blood, not quite, but something old, iron-scented. They pressed on. A second hour passed. Then came the smell. Not smoke, not wood, but burnt meat. They crept forward more slowly now, steps hushed, breath caught in throats. Ellen clutched a staff in her hand, her fingers white around the grain. Tom walked ahead, shoulders tense. Aldous kept to the rear, quiet as a cat. Corwin said nothing, but his pace never faltered. Then, through the trees, they saw it. A clearing, a camp and a fire. Low, controlled. Burning not trees, but things, clothes, crates, a broken cart and 2 bodies, one still smouldering, one untouched, face pale beneath a tangle of red hair. Neither moved. Ellen stepped forward carefully. The living might still be near, but the camp was empty, except for the fire, the bodies, and a sigil painted on a stone near the edge. 3 interlocked circles. Ellen froze. It was the same symbol Mine wore around his neck. She knelt beside the painted stone, her breath shallow. The circles had been etched first, then filled with pigment, ochre and soot, the work of care, not haste. Tom was standing beside, the untouched body. "She's young," he said. "No older than Della." Corwin crouched by the burned one. He turned the head gently. They branded him too. Ellen flinched. Aldous approached her slowly. He pointed to the stone, then drew in the dirt beside it. His own bird, the carved one, he wore. But this time, it had no wings. It was bound. "They're not just symbols," she whispered. "They're marks. For belonging. or for ownership, Tom said grimly. They searched the camp. No food, no tools, only a single book, wrapped in waxed cloth and hidden beneath a sleeping mat. Ellen opened it with reverence. The pages were thin, covered in tight, angular script, but the ink was red, not brown, not black, red. She turned one page, then another. Drawings, diagrams, names, a ledger of people, of those taken, marked, counted, and, in the corner of one page, a single word written in a younger hand. Mine. Ellen closed the book. We take it back, she said. And the girl? Tom asked. Her name was Tilda, Corwin murmured. He had found a locket in her hand. Inside, a scrap of parchment. To my sister. I'll find you. They buried both bodies. Not deep. The earth was hard here, but they marked the graves with stones, and Aldous left one of his birds between them. A plain one, carved from greenwood, its beak open as if mid-song. They returned in silence. By the time they emerged from the forest, the sun was sinking. Back in Thistlebrook, the air felt heavier, not just from the burden they carried, but from the presence of truth. The well had not run dry from nature alone. The forests hid more than deer and old trails. Someone, or something, was hunting, branding, owning, and mine, silent mine, had escaped from it. When they returned, Ellen placed the red ink book in the chapel, beside the Virgin's feet. She did not open it again. Instead, she lit a candle and wrote in the Book of Echoes. The world beyond the trees carries its own sickness, not of flesh, but of control. Let this place remain unclaimed. Mine approached the book that evening. He stared at it a long while. Then he reached out, touched its cover gently, and whispered a single word. Enough. No one questioned what he meant. No one asked. But that night, every door in Thistlebrook was barred, and every child slept with an elder beside them. The next day, Cecily painted a new symbol on the village boundary, a ring of thorns surrounding a bird, a warning, a prayer, a line. And for the first time in many moons, the people of Thistlebrook remembered what it meant to defend not just survival, but freedom. Autumn waned into that strange, quiet season before winter, a span of days when fog clung low to the fields, and every breath seemed to hang in the air a little too long. It was during this time that Thistlebrook began to sleep in shifts. It started with a whisper. We should keep watch. No one had seen movement beyond the forest, no fresh smoke, no signs of riders. But something had been stirred when they found the branded dead and the red-inked ledger, a stillness in the woods that felt less like peace and more like the hush before an arrow's flight, and so they built fires. 3 to start. 1 near the stream, 1 on the chapel's north side, 1 atop the old mill mound, long since abandoned, but still the tallest point for miles. Tom offered to tend the first nights. Fire on the mound. I've hammered steel in worse weather, he grunted, pulling a wool cloak around his shoulders. And I've sat longer waiting for a stubborn goat to carve. Ellen joined him, despite his grumbling. So did Corwin. Aldous brought kindling and a satchel of dried roots to chew. By dusk, the fire crackled, painting gold across their faces, chasing. The creeping chill from their bones. They said little, but their silence was companionable. Below them, the village slept, or pretended to. Candlelight glimmered behind shuttered windows. Shadows moved across drawn cloth. Even those who laid down in bed with eyes closed did so with ears alert. The fire became ritual. Each night, different pairs climbed the mound. Cecily brought tea, brewed with mint and crushed dried plum. Della embroidered by firelight, quiet and intent. Even little Joan took a shift once, seated between Ellen and Corwin, her small hands wrapped tight around a mug of nettle broth, her eyes wide but unafraid. What are we watching for? She asked. Ellen smiled faintly. Anything. That doesn't belong. Joan had nodded solemnly. Like silence that feels loud? Ellen squeezed her hand. Exactly that. On the 5th night, the wind changed. It blew cold from the east, strange and sharp, bringing with it the scent of wood smoke not their own. They could not see its source, but it was wrong. Darker, bitter. Cecily identified it immediately. Oak and fat wood. Green burning. That's no hearth fire. That's signal fire. They doubled the watch. Corwin fashioned a horn from a hollowed ram's horn and taught Aldous how to blow it in bursts. Once for warning, twice for danger, 3 for run, Tom. Strung up bells along the lower path, a line of rusted metal tied with twine, ready to sing if disturbed. And mine? He began to listen. He had not spoken again since whispering, "Enough." But he moved with purpose now, climbing roofs to watch the tree line, standing in doorways with a hand on the lintel, tapping rhythms into stones like he was sending messages, underground. He became Thistlebrook's quiet sentinel. Once, Ellen found him at the chapel door, staring up at the Virgin with a strange mixture of defiance and awe. He held something in his hands. A stone, carved into a circle, 3 loops joined. At the center, the mark, but this one was broken, a slash through its center. Cracked. He placed it at the Virgin's feet and walked away. That night, the fire on the mound burned higher. No one slept. The wind sang through the trees like a dirge. Ellen sat beside the flames, her hands curled around the ledger. She wrote by firelight. We are learning the art of vigilance, not as warriors, but as survivors who remember too well what it costs to be unprepared. Then she looked up and saw eyes across the field. Just beyond the reach of the firelight. 2 glints, then gone. Not animal, too still, too deliberate. She did not cry out. She rose, stepped to Tom's side, and whispered, "We're seen." He did not ask how. He simply took the horn from Aldous, held it steady, waited, but nothing came. No footsteps, no voice, only the sense of being measured, watched, weighed, and found wanting, or perhaps not yet ready. By morning, the eyes had vanished. But deep footprints remained near the lower path, too large for child, too shallow for boot. Bare feet. Ellen traced them with her fingers, then turned to the others. We're not the only ones who've survived, Tom spat into the dirt. I'd prefer ghosts. They did not stop the watchers, they added more. A system. Rotations dot night whistles made of deer bone. They taught the children to listen for certain birds, owls, jays, the song of the night thrush, and to know when that song meant trouble. They placed fresh paint on the boundary markers, refreshed the symbol of thorns and birds, and beneath it carved a new line. We see, we endure, we answer. Ellen began wearing her key around her neck, a simple iron shape, cold and smooth, the one that unlocked the ledger's box, the stores, the chapel chest. Not because she feared theft, but because it reminded her, there, stories mattered now more than ever. Not just to be told, but to be defended. That 7th night, no fire was lit, not by design, but by weather. A sudden rainstorm swept across the valley, battering the mound, dousing the flames, and scattering the watchers. But Aldous remained. He sat in the rain, soaked to the skin, holding his newest carving in both hands. A figure this time, not a bird, not a beast. A boy, arms outstretched, mouth open, as if crying out. When Ellen approached and knelt beside him, he whispered, I dreamed him, in the trees, watching, waiting. She took the figure from his hands, held it close, then lit a new fire herself, even in the rain, and as the sparks rose, she knew. This night would pass, but not without cost. The storm had tested more than the fire. It had tested their will, and found it burning still. The day after the storm, the fire pit atop the mill mound was dry. That should have been impossible. The earth there always turned to muck after heavy rain, and yet when Tom climbed the hill to relight the watchfire, he found a perfect circle of grey ash, bone dry, etched cleanly into the ground. It had not been left by nature, nor by any hand he knew. At the circle's edge lay 3 stones, arranged with deliberation, one black, one white, one streaked with red clay. Beneath them, scratched faintly into the packed soil, a message in lines and loops unfamiliar. Tom stared at it for a long time. Then he lit the fire anyway. When he returned to the village, he brought Ellen to the mound. She knelt at the edge of the circle and traced the marks with her finger. "They've made contact," she murmured. "Who?" Tom asked. She didn't answer, because the truth was, she didn't know. But deep inside, she sensed something older than kings or plague had moved through the woods and left its mark. Something that watched, yes, but something that also waited. That evening, Ellen gathered the council and the quiet ones, not just Tom and Cecily, but Della, Aldous, Corwin, Mine, and even a shepherd boy who spoke only to his dog but saw things before others did. They sat around the fire in the chapel's courtyard. Mine, who had not spoken since the clearing, finally raised his head and said, "It's a request." They turned to him. He pointed to the ash circle drawn on a scrap of parchment Ellen had copied. "They use fire, not to threaten, but to speak." Cecily frowned. "And what do they want?" Mine hesitated, then drew a small circle in the dirt beside the fire. Within it, he placed 4 pebbles, then, outside the circle, 1. "They want to meet," he said slowly, "but only those who choose." A silence fell. Crows shifted on the chapel roof. Ellen breathed deeply. "If we go," she said, "we go as ourselves. No masks, no weapons drawn," Tom growled low. "And if they don't come with peace, then we return," she said. "We listen, we learn, but we do not bow." That night, they prepared. Not with swords, for they had few, but with words and witnesses. Aldous carved a small token, a disc of wood with a bird perched within a circle of thorns. He hung it from Ellen's neck before she left. "Speak for us," he said. Ellen, Mine, Corwin, and Cecily were chosen, 4 souls, each touched by loss, each bound to the village by more than duty. They walked out beneath a moon sharp as flint. The forest welcomed them with fog. The path beyond the old timber trail, long thought lost, opened that night, not as a road, but as a corridor of hush and silver, lit faintly by strange glows along tree trunks, lichen or paint or something else. No birds called, no beasts stirred, but the path led, and they followed. An hour passed, then another, and finally they reached it. The clearing. Not the same one as before. This was different, wider, ringed by trees that leaned inward, like witnesses in council, and in the center, a circle of ash, empty, still, waiting. Ellen stepped forward and placed her token in the circle. The wind changed. From the trees emerged 5 figures, hooded, silent. Each bore a mark, circle upon circle, some whole, some split. They did not speak at first. They simply stood across the circle and watched. Then one stepped forward, removed her hood. She was older than Ellen had expected, grey-haired with a scar along her chin and eyes dark as peat. She knelt and drew the same 3 stones, black, white, red. Then, in clear voice, said, "You are not what we were told." Ellen stepped forward. "We were told nothing," she replied, "only shown signs." The woman nodded. "Then we begin again." And thus, the Ash Circle Pact was formed, not in ink, but in vow. The hooded ones were called the Remnants. Survivors, yes, but not of the plague alone. Survivors of places where the sickness had been used not as curse, but as tool. Some lords sealed themselves inside halls, the woman said. Some burned their fields. Others chose power over people. They branded the healthy, traded the weak, built empires from bone. The remnants had fled that, had built hidden circles in forgotten woods, had watched, had waited, and now they had seen Thistlebrook. We saw how you bury, the woman said, how you sing, how you guard not just walls, but memory. And what do you want? Corwin asked. The woman answered, to share. The remnants had knowledge of healing, of planting, of signs in the stars, but they needed places to pass it on, places that would not turn them into weapons, places that remembered the value of names, not numbers, places like Thistlebrook. The pact was made in silence, a token exchanged, a fire lit, and a promise spoken by both. What endures must not forget. They returned before dawn. Weary, soot-streaked, changed. The village met them with tense faces, questions in their eyes. But when Ellen raised the token, a bird within a circle, they understood, not in words, but in feeling, that something old had passed through them and something new had taken root. That night, no fire was lit on the mound. Instead, candles were placed in every window, and at the center of the village square, a ring of ash was drawn. Aldous traced it with his fingers and whispered, "Now we are seen." Ellen added a line to her ledger. Peace is not the absence of threat. It is the recognition of kinship where once we saw only shadows. The first frost came early that year. It crept in without herald, sheathing the fields in silver and whispering across the thatched rooftops like a veil drawn over sleeping faces. The well remained dry, though the stream flowed thinly still, and the ash circle in the village square darkened with every passing dawn, a faint reminder of promises made beneath older trees. Thistlebrook was quiet, not with dread, but with waiting. They had made a pact, yes, but no salvation had followed, no sudden gifts of grain or herds of returning deer. The remnants did not send supplies or cures. What they offered instead was knowledge, and knowledge comes slowly in winter. The first gift arrived on the wind, a leaf, pressed flat and wrapped in wax cloth, left beneath the chapel door. It came with a simple note, in the same slanted hand that had marked the ashes. Burn with pine, breathe, sleep will come. Cecily tried it that night, mixing the leaf with dried pine needles and setting them to smoulder near the cot of a coughing elder who had not slept more than an hour since the harvest failed. She slept 6 hours, dreamless. The village took note. So began the season of small wonders. Not miracles, not magic, but offerings. A sprig that stopped a fever, a knotting technique that strengthened fraying rope, a way to dry root vegetables in the chimney that preserved them twice as long. They were never accompanied by names, never by demands, only wrapped in linen or tucked beneath stone, always marked with the triple circle broken. And so the people of Thistlebrook began to offer back. A bundle of carved birds, a vial of Cecily's blackthorn cough tincture, a song written by Joan in childish letters and left tied to a branch along the timber trail. The forest answered with stillness, with no more footprints in the snow, with no more fires beyond the trees. It was a silence of acknowledgement. And in that silence, the village learned to listen differently. They heard the creak of beams as language, the murmur of stream ice as music, the rustle of leaves as suggestion, and beneath the Virgin in the chapel, where the letters of distant kin still came, Ellen began to record not just stories, but methods. In a new book, bound with twine and bark, she collected each gift, each trade, each use. She titled it simply, The Book of Keeping. Because what mattered now was not simply living, but remembering how. Winter deepened. Snow came, soft and sure. The children skated on the stream with planks tied to their feet, laughing more freely than they had in years. Bread was stretched with root flour, soup with herbs and pebbles warmed to make broth seem richer. Scarves were shared, blankets doubled, windows shuttered tightly each evening with sprigs of rowan tucked into their hinges. One night, Tom made music. He found an old fiddle, warped but mendable, and played a tune his mother had sung to him as a child. It was a slow, loping melody, part sorrow, part lullaby, and no one knew the words anymore, but they hummed, they danced. Ellen watched from the chapel steps, a mug of honeyed nettle tea in her hands. Aldous sat beside her, carving. "What are you making?" she asked. He turned the figure toward her. It was a woman, not with a crown, not with wings, but holding a book, one hand open to offer, the other closed around its spine. "Ellen," he whispered. She blinked, startled, then smiled, and said nothing, because some things are not answered with words. The next morning, they awoke to find mine gone, his cot untouched, his token left beside the cold fire pit, but in its place, a pile of firewood, a bundle of herbs, and a new bird, carved in a style none of them had seen before, its feathers notched, its beak open, wide as if calling something forward. They knew he had returned to the remnants, or gone beyond them. They did not grieve. They simply marked his place. A small stone, painted white, with his name carved in runes only Aldous could decipher. That night, the crows returned, but not to steal. They perched quietly along the chapel roof, along the fencing posts, along the ash circle in the square, dozens of them, watching, and, when dawn broke, not one remained, but in their place, a ring of pine cones, set precisely at the chapel steps. Cecily wept. No one asked why. Spring would not come for many weeks, but something thawed anyway. The people of Thistlebrook began teaching again. Not just skills, but histories. Ellen led lessons beside the hearth, reciting names, tales, and the paths of stars. Cecily taught remedies, Tom the secrets of metal and wood, Della the ways of wool. Aldous taught silence, and Joan, for all her youth, began writing stories, not about queens or saints, but about them, about the boy who carved birds, and the woman who listened to trees, about the village that fed fire with words instead of fuel. Each tale ended the same, and they remembered, because that, more than anything, had become the law of survival. Not dominance, not might, but memory. By the time the last snow melted, Thistlebrook had changed once more, not in shape, not in walls, but in weight. It had become something greater than itself. Not a fortress, not a relic, but a seed. Waiting, ready, watching the horizon for what came next. Ellen wrote in the final page of her winter ledger, "We are not what came before. We are not yet what comes after. But we are the thread. And threads, when held together, do not break. They weave." It was just past the equinox when the stranger came. The first crocuses had begun to pierce the thawing earth, and the village was caught in that soft in-between, where winter's breath still lingered in the mornings. But birds dared to sing at noon. The ash circle in the square had faded, rained upon, walked through by children and hens alike. But its meaning remained. They had almost forgotten how to fear, until the rider appeared. He did not come at dawn, or dusk, or under cover of storm. He arrived in full daylight, cloaked in travel-stained wool, his horse lean, his boots caked with red dust, not of this land. No standard flew from his saddle, no crest upon his cloak, only a long, wrapped bundle slung across his back and a token of rusted bronze at his belt. A coin pierced through the center. He did not ask for food, or water, or shelter. He asked one thing only. "Which among you is the keeper of the names?" The words fell like frost. Ellen stepped forward, her hands steady, the book of keeping clutched against her chest. I am. The stranger dismounted, slowly. Then you are the one I've sought. His voice was low, not rough, not noble, just tired, like someone who had walked too long in silence. They offered him bread. He took only a mouthful. They offered him water. He drank sparingly. Then, as the villagers gathered in the square, he unwrapped the bundle on his back. It was a scroll, longer than any Ellen had ever seen, more cloth than parchment, stitched and bound and blackened at the edges by smoke. As he unrolled it, symbols unfurled, names, places, sigils, numbers, all rendered in bold red ink. She knew that ink, so did mine, so did the dead girl in the clearing. The remnants had warned of records like these, ownership ledgers made in the years of plague, when kings and warlords and rogue lords had marked survivors not by village but by value. He pointed to a line near the top. Do you see this? Ellen nodded slowly. The mark beside the name was a broken circle, pierced by a line. One she had seen only once before, in the Book of Echoes. This was my sister. He looked up. She was taken. I followed the trail for 4 winters. Through charred manors and salt-ridden coasts. Through fever camps and merchant records. And you found this? Tom asked. I found what remained. Her name, stripped of voice. Her value, calculated by age, by strength, by womb. No one spoke, not even the wind. Ellen reached forward and traced the name on the scroll, then turned and opened her own book. Slowly, steadily, she wrote that name again. This time in black ink. This time with intention. What's your name? She asked softly. He hesitated, then said, They called me Tannic. She nodded. Tannic of the South Road, she said, as if it had always belonged. That night, the chapel was full. They lit every candle. They read every name from the stranger's scroll, not with judgment, but with witness. Each name was echoed aloud. Some were followed by a breath, some by tears, some by nothing at all, but still they were spoken. At the end, Tannic folded the scroll. I burned the others, he said. Ledgers, records, chains written in ink. But this one, I kept because someone had to bring it home. Cecily stepped forward and offered him a bowl of honeyed milk. For your voice, she said. He drank it and stayed. Days passed. Tannic became part of the pattern, not swiftly, not without pauses, but with the slow, familiar rhythm of someone relearning the art of community. He fixed the chapel's sagging door. He helped Aldous build birdhouses for spring. He taught Joan to read the older markings on trade tokens, signs from a forgotten network of merchants and messengers, and each evening he copied names, from his scroll into the Book of Keeping, from the Book of Keeping into smaller letters, to be sent outward again, to other villages, other survivors, the silent unknown. Why do you do it? Della asked one morning, watching him dip his pen. He looked up, and for a moment, she saw a much younger man behind the weariness. Because someone once told me that names, when forgotten, become ghosts. But if we keep them, they become seeds. A week after Tannic's arrival, a new scroll appeared, this one tied to the chapel door with red thread. No one saw who left it, but the ink was brown, and the writing delicate. Inside were 20 new names. No marks, no values, just stories. Of a village in the east that had survived in silence, of mothers who hid their children beneath floorboards, of a boy who spoke to bees. Ellen read every name aloud, and the people listened. Because Thistlebrook was no longer just a village. It was a hearth, a place where voices returned, where the branded and the broken brought their last fragments and found not pity, but place. They buried the ashes of Tannic's scroll on the old mound, beneath the stone where the watchfires had burned. And on that spot, Aldous carved one final symbol, a circle, open at one side, with roots curling out, not closed, not bound, but reaching. Spring came slowly, not in a rush of bloom, but in a careful thaw, each day untying another knot in winter's long, cold braid. It began with green mist clinging to branches. Then birds returned, not all at once, but in careful pairs, scouting the eaves of old cottages, chirping at the corners of forgotten gutters. The stream swelled slightly. Frogs reappeared in the reeds, and someone, no one knew who, planted a row of leeks near the chapel wall. By the time the first soft rains came, Thistlebrook had begun to dig again. Not graves, but a garden. It was Ellen's idea, or perhaps it wasn't hers alone. It had hovered, in the breath of every morning conversation, in the glances exchanged over half-emptied stores. But she had spoken it aloud first, standing beside the ash circle, one hand on the book of keeping. "We've kept their names," she said. "Now let's give them roots." No one asked for permission. They simply began. They chose the old orchard, long overgrown, where the trees leaned like aging uncles and brambles guarded the ghosts of apples. It was the only land not already spoken for by livestock or path, and it held the richest soil, dark, moist, veined with worms. Each person brought something: seeds, scraps, tools sharpened and bound with twine, and names, because each row was not just planted with vegetables, but with memory. Row 1 was for Marek, the boy who had vanished into the fog. Carrots and onions. Row 2 for Tilda, the branded girl buried in the woods. Cabbage and sage. Row 3 for mine, the silent shadow who had never stopped watching. Beans tied with string. Each name was marked by a stone, carved or painted, or sometimes just scratched in with a finger. But each bore a name spoken aloud as the seed was tucked into the earth. They called it the Garden of Holding. It became more than a field, it became a ritual. Children pressed seedlings into mud with reverence. Elders watered the rows with warmed stream water. Cecily brewed tea from the earliest sprouts and left cups on each marked stone. Not for ghosts, but for witness. And the vegetables grew. Oh, how they grew. Faster than any crop had since before the plague. Cecily said it was the soil. Tom said it was the watchfires that had driven off the rot in the ground. Tannick only shrugged and said, "Some names feed better than others." Ellen recorded every planting in her ledger, but she also began writing something new. A second book, bound in leather and sealed with a thorn clasp. She called it the Garden Codex. Not just a record of growth, but a guide, how deep to plant, which chants the children sang that seemed to help sprouts bloom, which stones warmed best in sunlight, and which kept pests at bay when ringed around the perimeter. What the wind sounded like just before a new shoot broke the surface. The garden taught them listening again, not to the sky, but to each other. Because some villagers wept as they dug. Some smiled and said nothing. Some spoke names no one else recognized, and everyone accepted them as truth, because every name mattered, even the ones no longer remembered by anyone else. One day, Joan found a seedling growing outside the garden walls, tucked in a crack of the chapel steps. It hadn't been planted, not by hand, but a stone lay beside it. One marked Gareth, the boy who had once left for bread and never returned. They left the sprout alone, and it grew taller than any inside the garden walls. Some called it a miracle, others simply a return. By mid-spring, the garden bore its first fruits, green and knobbly, misshapen, but rich with taste. They harvested in silence, shared with ceremony, brought bowls to the center of the square and ate together, seated on wool throws and old crates, passing wooden spoons hand to hand. And after each meal, someone would stand and say a name. That was the rule. Not grace, not prayer, just a name. Then a single word, spoken aloud. Remembered. It was Joan, again, who proposed the festival. She had written the idea on a strip of birch bark, tied it to the Virgin's garland, and waited. And one morning, Ellen found it. Let us dance for what grew. The idea bloomed like the beans. They set a day, when the moon hung full and the lilac first flowered. They called it the naming day, not of saints, not of lords, but of each other. They made garlands from rosemary and ivy, painted faces with beet juice and clay. Della spun ribbons from sheep's wool dyed with nettle. Tom carved a pole from a fallen elm, and the children strung it with names written on bark and cloth. The morning of the festival was cold, but hearts were warm. They sang not hymns, but songs passed mouth to mouth, lullabies, work chants, fragments, remembered and rethreaded into new melodies. They danced, they shared, and they named. Ellen stood beside the garden, her hand on the book of keeping, and read a full page aloud, then another, and another. And when the last name had been spoken, the village fell into silence, not mournful, not even solemn, just still, because for the first time since the plague, since the branding, since the silence and the eyes in the woods, they had found something whole, not safety, not eternity, but belonging. The garden rustled in the breeze, and the birds kept singing. Years would pass, as years do, not with fanfare, but with the slow turning of seasons, with winters that bit and springs that soothed, with summers that gave just enough and autumns that always whispered goodbye too early. And still, Thistlebrook endured. The well never returned. The stream narrowed, but the garden of holding grew wide, each year pushing farther into the orchard's edges until apple trees bore fruit again and foxes made dens beneath the yews, no longer fearing man. The chapel aged, its beams bowed. The Virgin's missing hand was never found, but Joan, grown, tall and honey-voiced, carved a new one from ashwood and fastened it gently with pitch and prayer. The watchfires burned less often, not because danger was gone, but because the people had learned how to read the dark. And the book of keeping, it grew fat, its spine cracked from use, its pages a map not of borders or bloodlines, but of names, each one a root, each one a thread in the tapestry that was no longer unraveling, but reweaving itself. Ellen, older now, still held the key. It hung around her neck, dulled by time, warmed by the skin it had never left. She walked with a stick, carved by alders, whose birds now hung from rafters in villages far beyond the old border paths. One day, in early autumn, a child from a northern village came walking into Thistlebrook, dusty, barefoot, holding a letter wrapped in beeswax cloth. She asked for the woman who knows the names. Joan met her with bread, Della with wool to wrap her feet, and Ellen, slow but smiling, welcomed her to the bench outside the chapel. "What is your name, little wanderer?" The girl sat straight. "Jun." "And what brings you here, Jun?" She unwrapped the letter. "My village found this, in a tree stump near the East Marsh. My father said it was too old to mean anything, but my gran remembered. She said Thistlebrook was where names go to live." Ellen opened the letter. Faded ink, crumbling edges, but the words still whispered, "To the one who kept me whole by writing me down. I am still here. I have made it through winter." It was signed simply, Tilda. Ellen closed her eyes, held the letter to her heart, then opened the book. "Would you help me write it, Jun?" The girl nodded solemnly, and they wrote. Tilda of the Ash Circle survived in silence, remembered in bloom. Jun stayed, a week, then 2. She swept floors, planted herbs, carved her own name on a stone at the edge of the garden, not because she expected to die, but because she understood. Names are not only for the gone, they are for the witnessed. Ellen wrote her final entry in the Book of Keeping one morning as the frost returned to the edges of the stream. We survived the plague, but survival was never the end. We survived the forgetting, and in that we began again. Then she closed the book, passed the key to Joan, and rested. Not in a bed of silk, not in a tomb of stone, but beneath the apple tree by the garden's edge, wrapped in a shawl of Della's weaving, with one of Aldous' birds tucked beneath her hands. She did not ask for a monument, but the villagers built one anyway, a bench carved from the elm Tom had always loved, etched with vines and names and birds and broken circles that now meant something healed, and on its back they wrote, "Here sat the one who remembered." Not long after, messengers began arriving, not in armor, not with banners, but with books, with letters, with requests to learn. What had Thistlebrook done? What had Thistlebrook? How had they kept the sickness from returning? How had they survived? And so, Joan began to teach. Cecily's grandchildren shared recipes. Della hosted weavers from distant coastlands. Tannic, long quiet, returned with new scrolls, filled not with brands, but births. And each spring, the naming day was celebrated anew. Villages nearby began to hold their own. Wreaths were sent between borders. Children grew up knowing that to name was to anchor, to remember was to rebuild. And Thistlebrook, which once had only ashes and sorrow, became a place not of fame or fortune, but of foundation. It was whispered that when travellers passed through, the birds grew quieter, as if listening, that the wind turned warm near the garden, that the air carried not scent, but story. They were not without grief or hardship. But now, when loss came, it came into hands ready to hold it, to write it, to sow it back into the earth. Because that was the secret, the one never recorded in any king's decree or healer's tome. It was never just survival that mattered. It was the keeping, the naming, the belonging. In the end, plague did not win, nor power. What endured was memory, and so the story rests, not ended, but placed gently on the shelf beside the candlelight, waiting. Should you, dear dreamer, ever feel lost, you now know the way. Just follow the path of names, back to the garden, back to the bench, back to the place that remembers, back to Thistlebrook.